There is a particular hour that comes once, perhaps twice in a person's life, when the entire architecture of a nation's future turns on a single conversation between two men in a room where no one else is listening. And the outcome depends not on law or votes or public decree, but on the depth of one man's word and the trust that another chooses to place in it. In the autumn of 1893, as gas lamps flickered along Wall Street and the great banking houses of Lower Manhattan drew their velvet curtains against the gathering dark, such an hour arrived. The United States Treasury was hemorrhaging gold, the nation's currency hung by a thread, and somewhere in the financial districts where clerks still worked by lamplight, moving deposits by hand on ledgers that would never fully capture the invisible movement of capital itself, the question forming in every mind was not who the president was or what Congress might do, but whether one private banker could be persuaded to save the country from collapse. That this question even existed is itself remarkable. Yet in the gilded world of the 1890s, when America was still young enough to be vulnerable, still unguarded enough to admit its desperate need for the guidance of those who understood how markets moved, and credit flowed, and capital could be marshaled or withheld, it was not remarkable at all. It was simply the way the world worked. If you are drawn to stories of how power actually operates behind the velvet curtain, how fortunes shape nations and nations reshape fortunes, how one life lived with absolute discipline and almost inhuman clarity of purpose can ripple across an entire century, then I invite you to subscribe and join us on these slow journeys into the hidden architecture of modern history. These are stories that unfold not in headlines but in ledgers, not in speeches, but in the quiet gravity of a handshake that changes everything. And now, let us return to that world and the place where our story begins. The Hudson River, at night in that era, was a thing of profound beauty and quiet menace. The water reflected nothing as much as possibility. From the docks where ships still arrived bearing goods from every corner of the globe, to the warehouses where fortunes were stored and traded in the form of cotton and silk and spice and gold, there moved at all hours an invisible economy that most people never saw and perhaps could never quite understand. The mist rose off the water in those autumn nights, and if you walked along the pilings where the great steamships rested, you might hear the creak of the vessels, the slap of water against wood, the distant cry of a night watchman, and beneath it all, something else, something like the pulse of an enormous engine turning. Wall Street itself, at this hour and in this era, was a corridor of shadows and lamplight. The great banking houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their facades of granite and marble catching the glow of the street lamps in such a way as to make them appear almost timeless, as though they had been built not yesterday, but in some distant century, and had simply endured. The storefronts were dark, the offices above were mostly empty, save for those few private chambers where important business did not conclude until long after the ordinary world had gone to sleep. Inside these rooms, tall windows looked out onto the city's restless night. Mahogany paneling absorbed the lamplight. Leather chairs held the weight of men who had made decisions that moved markets and redirected the flow of capital across continents. These were the banking houses that had grown up in the decades after the Civil War, in that extraordinary age when America was transforming itself from a nation of farms and small towns into something far vaster and more complicated. Railroads were being strung across the continent. Steel mills were rising in Pittsburgh and Chicago. Mines were being opened in the West. Capital was being summoned from everywhere, from the rich industrial cities of the Northeast, from London and Paris, from anywhere that money could be borrowed against the promise of a future that seemed not just possible but inevitable. And all of this vast, chaotic, brilliant, often ruthless transformation flowed through these buildings on Wall Street, through the hands and minds of bankers who had learned not just to manage money, but to orchestrate it, to conduct it like a great invisible symphony. The quiet of Wall Street at night was deceptive. It suggested rest, dormancy, the simple absence of bustle. But it was not the quiet of sleep. It was something closer to the quiet that precedes a storm, or the quiet within a storm's eye, a temporary stillness before the next movement, the next shift. The money that moved on Wall Street moved in such volumes and with such speed that you could not actually watch it happen. It existed in ledgers and telegrams, and the understanding between men who had learned to read each other across decades. It existed in the memory of past transactions and the projection of future ones. It existed in trust, which is to say it existed in the spaces between what could be proven and what must simply be believed. The lampposts along the avenue cast their light in perfect circles, and between those circles was darkness. A carriage might pass, drawn by horses whose breath steamed in the cool air. The driver would be taking someone home late from business, or to a restaurant where deals were still being negotiated over brandy and cigars. The buildings themselves seemed to lean inward, as though they were all leaning toward the same center point, the same great exchange where value was created and redistributed and sometimes lost forever. What no one walking those streets in 1893 could have known with certainty was that the era of ease and assumed growth was coming to an end. The assumptions on which the entire financial structure had been built were beginning to crack. Factories were overproducing, prices were falling, investors were growing nervous, gold reserves were moving out of the country, banks in the South and West were failing, and slowly, with the inevitability of water finding the lowest point, the crisis was concentrating itself, moving eastward, toward New York, toward Wall Street, toward the very heart of the nation's financial being. In a matter of months, the question would no longer be theoretical. It would become actual and urgent and impossible to ignore, and a man whose name was just beginning to be known beyond the tight circles of high finance would step into a position of authority that no private citizen should perhaps have been allowed to occupy. But that hour had not yet come, for now the night was still beautiful along the Hudson, the ships creaked, the gas lamps burned steadily, the city breathed, and somewhere in the darkness above the streets, in offices lit by lamplight, men were writing letters and reading cables and thinking about tomorrow, when everything might be different. The story that will unfold across these hours is the story of how one man came to occupy that extraordinary position. It is the story of J.P. Morgan, and to understand him, we must first understand the world into which he was born, and the long, patient accumulation of knowledge and discipline and will that shaped his rise. If you find yourself drawn into these quieter corridors of history, these moments where individual lives shaped the very architecture of the modern world, you might consider subscribing to this collection of slow, richly researched journeys through the past. Each one unfolds at the pace of genuine understanding, without hurry or distraction, inviting you to settle into the kind of deep historical narrative that rewards the patient listener. These are stories of power and ambition, yes, but also of the human beings beneath the public figures, the private struggles and intellectual appetites that drove them forward. They're crafted specifically for those hours when the mind is most receptive, when the world outside falls away and you can attend fully to the texture of a life, the architecture of an era, the slow accumulation of consequence that history so rarely grants us time to truly witness. The Gilded Age, that extraordinary bloom of American finance and industrial ambition that stretched across the second half of the 19th century, produced few figures as compelling or as contradictory as the man we're about to meet. To understand him is to understand something essential about power itself, how it accumulates, how it's wielded, how it transforms both the person who possesses it and the world around it. It's the kind of understanding that doesn't arrive through simple proclamation, but rather through patient reconstruction, through following the threads backward from consequence to cause, from the man in his maturity to the boy he once was. And so this channel exists to offer you that kind of patient reconstruction across many lives and many eras, always at a rhythm that honors both accuracy and the simple human need for narrative depth. The story you're listening to now is only one thread in a much longer tapestry. There are others waiting: the quiet rise of American industrial families, the intricate dance of transatlantic commerce, the way a single person's vision can ripple outward to remake an entire landscape of human endeavor. When this particular journey has carried you towards sleep, you'll find others here, equally unhurried, equally devoted to the premise that history is most truly learned when we stop rushing toward conclusions and simply sit with the weight and wonder of it all. For now, though, let us return to the darkened streets we glimpsed at the beginning of this story, to the gaslit facades and the river breezes, to the moment in the 1890s when a particular man's influence was beginning to crystallize into something almost unprecedented in American life. To understand how he arrived at that pinnacle, we must first trace the origins from which he came, the family whose name he would eventually bear so distinctively, and the inheritance, not merely financial, but intellectual and temperamental, that shaped the contours of his ambition. His family did not spring from the great industrial fortunes of the railroads or the steel mills. Rather, they emerged from an older tradition, one rooted in the patient accumulation of capital through trade and the careful management of transatlantic commerce. The Morgans traced their American lineage back to Connecticut and Massachusetts, to merchants and minor landholders, the sort of families who built their influence gradually through reliability and restraint rather than audacious speculation. There was, even in those early generations, a kind of discipline embedded in the family character, a preference for solid accumulation over dramatic displays of wealth. The man who would elevate this comfortable obscurity into something approaching dynastical power was born into a generation that witnessed the transformation of American finance. And to truly comprehend his rise, we must first understand the world into which he was born, the particular confluence of circumstance and temperament that prepared him for the extraordinary role he would eventually claim. The Morgan story does not begin in the gilded parlors of Wall Street or in the marble halls where nations negotiated their financial salvation. It begins much earlier, in the quieter hinterlands of Connecticut, in a place called Hartford, where a man named Joseph Morgan, Pierpont's grandfather, kept a modest counting house and moved through the world of commerce with the methodical steadiness that would become a family inheritance, passed down like silverware or land. Joseph Morgan was not wealthy, not in the way the Gilded Age would come to understand wealth. He was respectable, he was known, and in the merchant culture of early America, that distinction mattered enormously. The year was 1813, when Joseph Morgan's son, Junius Spencer Morgan, was born into this atmosphere of competence and careful ambition. The world at that moment was convulsed. Napoleon's wars still echoed across the Atlantic, and the young American Republic was finding itself locked in its own conflict with Britain. But in Hartford, in the Morgan household, the focus was narrower, more practical. What does a boy learn when he is raised in a counting house? He learns to read ledgers before he reads poetry. He learns that numbers are a language, and that the men who speak that language most fluently are the men who move the world. He learns that trust is a commodity more precious than gold, and that a man's word, once broken, cannot be repaired by any amount of subsequent sincerity. Junius Morgan grew. As a young man, he possessed the qualities that the merchant class of that era prized above almost all others: a cool temperament, an appetite for work that seemed to have no bottom, and a peculiar gift for seeing patterns in trade that others could not quite perceive. He did not distinguish himself through flashy gestures or the kind of public speech-making that drew attention in political circles. Instead, he worked, he learned, he moved methodically through the banking houses of Boston, where the real money of America was beginning to accumulate in those early decades of the 19th century. It was in Boston that Junius encountered the world of transatlantic commerce, in its most sophisticated form. Boston merchants were not merely buying and selling goods across the ocean, they were moving capital, they were negotiating credit, they were learning to think of the world not as a collection of separate markets, but as a single, interconnected web where money flowing from London could finance a cotton crop in Georgia, and where that same crop, once transformed into cloth in Massachusetts mills, could be sold back to England at considerable profit. This was the architecture of global commerce in its infancy, and Junius Morgan had the gift of understanding how it worked. Do you ever wonder what draws certain men toward the invisible structures of commerce, toward the realm where fortunes are made not in the mine or the factory, but in the movement of paper and credit across an ocean? For Junius, it seems to have been something almost innate. He did not seek wealth for the ostentation it might provide. Indeed, throughout his life, he remained austere in his personal habits, more likely to be found at his desk than at a fashionable gathering. Rather, he seemed to understand, with an almost intuitive clarity, that commerce was a form of power. It was the power to move resources, to build things, to connect disparate parts of the world into a functioning whole. Around 1836, Junius Morgan made a choice that would reshape his life and, by extension, reshape the life of his son, who would not be born until several years later. He entered into a partnership with a London banker named George Peabody. The arrangement was audacious in its simplicity. Peabody, Morgan and Co. would serve as a bridge between American and British capital. They would take deposits in London and extend credit to American merchants and industrialists who needed funds to expand their operations. They would handle the sale of American government bonds and railroad securities to British investors hungry for American growth. They would, in essence, become the financial nervous system connecting the economies of two continents. This move to London was the pivot point. Junius Morgan had positioned himself at the very center of the greatest financial flows of the age. London in the 1830s and 1840s was the undisputed financial capital of the world. The British Empire was at the apex of its power. Money moved through London as blood moves through a body, and men like Junius Morgan, who understood how to direct and channel that flow, were themselves a form of power, quiet and enormous. What is fascinating to contemplate, as you rest with this history, is how little public recognition accompanied this rise. There were no newspaper articles celebrating Junius Morgan's brilliance. He conducted no interviews. He gave no speeches about his financial philosophy. He simply worked, year after year, becoming more expert, more trusted, more indispensable to the men who controlled the great fortunes of both nations. Gradually, Peabody and Morgan became one of the most respected banking houses in the world. Their word was considered as good as gold. Their judgments about the creditworthiness of American ventures carried weight in the London financial markets that would have seemed almost magical to an outside observer. The 1840s and 1850s saw Junius Morgan moving deeper into this role, building relationships with the great merchant princes of London, with the heads of the Bank of England, with the financiers who were themselves financing the expansion of the British railway system and the consolidation of British commercial power around the globe. He became intimate with the details of American economic growth, the railroads pushing westward, the cotton trade that made the South wealthy, the emerging industrial capacity of the North. He learned to assess risk with a precision that bordered on the prescient. He understood currency fluctuations. He grasped the implications of trade deficits and surpluses. He could see, with an almost eerie clarity, where money would flow and where opportunities would emerge. There is something deeply meditative about contemplating the life of a man so entirely devoted to the mechanics of commerce and so entirely withdrawn from the public eye. Junius Morgan seems never to have sought the approval, or even the attention of society. He simply accumulated expertise and trust, the two currencies that matter most in the world of high finance. By the time his son was born, in 1837, Junius had already laid the foundation for everything that would follow. He had already established himself as a man of consequence, and he had already begun to weave the threads of transatlantic commerce into a network that would, within a generation, give his son access to power that few private citizens have ever wielded in the history of the world. The young boy who would become J.P. Morgan was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, a particularly robust child. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837, John Pierpont Morgan, though the family called him Pierpont, never John, entered a world of considerable comfort, but also considerable vulnerability. His constitution was marked from early life by the kinds of illnesses that haunted 19th-century childhoods, fevers and complaints that seemed to arrive without warning and linger without mercy. Rheumatic fever would visit him, that mysterious and debilitating infection that swelled joints and left children weakened for months at a time. There were other ailments too, less precisely named in the medical language of the era, but no less real in their effects on a developing mind and body. One wonders whether these early brushes with frailty, these months when a child must lie still and observe the world from a sickbed, might imprint something permanent on a person's temperament, a certain economy of movement perhaps, or a habit of interior vigilance. Yet it was precisely during these periods of confinement that Pierpont's father, Junius, and his mother Sarah recognized in their son something that transcended physical delicacy. His mind seemed to work with a peculiar intensity, undeterred by bodily weakness. While other children might have fretted against the constraints of illness, young Pierpont seemed to retreat into an almost meditative self-sufficiency. He became a watcher, an observer of patterns and detail. His parents, recognizing both his fragility and his capacity, made a fateful decision. The boy would require an education fashioned to strengthen not just his intellect, but his constitution, his very character. The education of a child in the mid-19th century, particularly one destined for the world of high finance, was an affair taken with utmost seriousness by families of standing. Junius Morgan, himself a man of disciplined bearing and ambitious vision, understood that his son would need to move fluidly across two worlds, the American mercantile sphere of his mother's family heritage in Hartford, and the transatlantic banking networks that were becoming the true center of Junius's own ascending power. To prepare Pierpont for this dual inheritance, his parents determined he would begin his formal education in Boston, that great center of American learning and mercantile culture. Boston schools in the 1840s were rigorous institutions, infused with the New England tradition of intellectual rigor, married to moral earnestness. The city itself, perched on its hills above the harbor, seemed to teach a lesson in order and consequence. Young Pierpont spent his formative years there, absorbing not merely the classical curriculum, Latin, Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy, but something less tangible and perhaps more valuable, the Boston sense that one's conduct, one's precision, one's reliability were all matters of paramount importance. But Boston alone, his parents concluded, would not suffice. The boy was growing taller, though never robust, and his education required exposure to the wider world that his father increasingly inhabited. When Pierpont reached his adolescence, the family made the decision to send him abroad, an undertaking that required considerable thought and not insignificant expense, yet one that was regarded as essential for a young man of his eventual station. In the early 1850s, Junius arranged for his son to continue his studies in Switzerland, a choice that reflected both practical and philosophical considerations. Switzerland, even then, was understood as a place of healthful mountain air, of pedagogical innovation, of cultural sophistication. Boarding schools in Switzerland served families of considerable wealth and ambition across Europe and America. To be educated there was to understand oneself as part of an international elite, a world in which national boundaries mattered less than the bonds of financial and intellectual networks. The Swiss years were formative in ways that extended well beyond the conventional acquisition of knowledge. Switzerland itself was a landscape that seemed to discipline the spirit, the precision of alpine peaks, the clarity of mountain air, the orderliness of Swiss institutions and manners. Pierpont, the boy from Hartford and Boston, was learning to move in a world of continental sophistication. He was becoming, by design and temperament, a man of the world, and yet there was something in his nature that resisted the easier sociability of his peers. He was not unkind by all accounts, but he was reserved. He did not seek out the casual friendships and frivolous attachments that animated the lives of other boarding school boys. Instead, he seemed to cultivate a kind of deliberate solitude, a quality that would become increasingly pronounced as he matured. After Switzerland came the next deliberate step in his intellectual formation, the German University of Göttingen. This was a particularly telling choice, reflecting Junius's understanding that his son's education required him to grasp the full dimensions of modern European thought and culture. Göttingen, in the Kingdom of Hanover, was at that time one of the great universities of German-speaking Europe, a place where mathematics, philosophy, and natural sciences flourished in an atmosphere of genuine intellectual rigor. To study at Göttingen was to participate in the revolution that had transformed 19th-century German academic life into something unprecedented, systematic, demanding, utterly uncompromising in its pursuit of truth and method. The young American student who arrived at Göttingen in the mid-1850s was not yet 20 years old, but he carried with him already the marks of his careful upbringing, an awareness of the world's order and hierarchy, a habit of disciplined study, a certain guardedness of manner. Göttingen refined these qualities into something sharper and more durable. Here, in lecture halls filled with the intensity of German pedagogy, Pierpont encountered minds and methods that would shape the way he approached problems for the rest of his life. He was not drawn to philosophy or pure theory, as some gifted students were. Instead, he gravitated toward the practical applications of knowledge, mathematics, accounting, the systems by which complex information could be organized, understood, and acted upon with precision. One might speculate that his earlier childhood illnesses had instilled in him a kind of philosophical patience, a willingness to observe before acting, a recognition that the world operates according to laws that can be understood if one applies sufficient concentration and discipline. The Göttingen years drew to a close after several semesters of study. Pierpont did not remain to complete a formal degree in the manner of many of his contemporaries. His father, seeing in his son a readiness to begin practical apprenticeship, called him back across the Atlantic. The education in Hartford, Boston, Switzerland, and Göttingen was complete, not in the sense of having exhausted all possible knowledge, but in the sense of having shaped a particular kind of mind. It was a mind that valued order, precision, and the accumulated wisdom of established systems. It was a mind, moreover, that had learned to work independently, to trust in its own judgment, and to move with quiet authority in rooms where others might falter. The childhood illnesses that had once seemed like vulnerabilities had, paradoxically, perhaps even been transformed through careful education and parental intention into something closer to advantages. They had created a space of interiority, a habit of concentrated thinking, an immunity to the shallow enthusiasms that might distract a more robust or carelessly educated young man. Pierpont Morgan, at the threshold of adulthood, was thus a product of deliberate cultivation. He was not a natural charmer, not a man who would win crowds through warmth or easy sociability. He was, instead, something perhaps more rare, a man who had been schooled, almost scientifically, in the disciplines that his era valued most: precision, restraint, the systematic organization of knowledge and resources. His travels through the great educational institutions of the Atlantic world had given him a sense of belonging to a transnational elite, yet his nature remained fundamentally private, almost withdrawn. And now, having absorbed all that Hartford and Boston, Switzerland and Göttingen could teach him, he was ready to begin the work that would, in time, reshape the financial architecture of a nation. It was in the autumn of 1857, when young Pierpont Morgan, now a man in his early 20s with the careful bearing his Swiss schooling had instilled, arrived in New York with a letter of introduction in his breast pocket and an inheritance modest enough to demand industry, but sufficient to command respect. The city sprawled before him in gaslit chaos, a forest of brick and timber, where fortunes were whispered into existence in cramped rooms above the street, where the smell of horse manure and coal smoke mingled with the smell of ledger paper and ink. He did not come to New York to conquer it. He came to learn it, the way a craftsman learns wood, with patience, with hands, with the understanding that mastery cannot be rushed. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, had already begun to build something extraordinary on the other side of the Atlantic. Junius had married into the banking world, had apprenticed in the great merchant houses of London, and had discovered, in the careful marriage of American growth and European capital, a kind of alchemy that most men never glimpsed. He sent his son across the ocean, not as a favor, but as an inheritance of method, the way a father teaches a son not to want quick money, but to understand how money itself thinks and breathes. The letter Pierpont carried was to the firm of Duncan, Sherman and Company, a respectable merchant banking house that moved capital between continents, that understood the strange dance between railroad stocks and government bonds, between the speculative fever of a growing nation and the conservative weight of old English money. The counting house was not a place of grandeur. Picture it in the mind's eye, a long room with high windows catching the winter light from the street below, clerks hunched over desks, arranged in neat rows, their pens scratching across ledger pages in that particular rhythm that governed the 19th century financial world. There was a boy on a stool running messages. There were senior men in waistcoats smoking cigars, their faces weathered by years of calculating which enterprises would fail and which would flourish. There was a logic to the room's organization, a hierarchy as strictly observed as in any court, and Pierpont Morgan, educated, connected, patient, began at the bottom not because he was unworthy, but because he understood that a man who does not know the weight of a ledger cannot understand the weight of capital. What was he learning exactly? Not merely arithmetic, though arithmetic mattered. He was learning to read the hidden language of commerce, the way a merchant banker could look at a proposal for a new mill or a canal or a railroad and see not what was written on paper, but what the future held. He was learning that speculation and conservatism were not opposites but partners in a careful dance, that the men who survived the recurring panics, and there were always panics, were those who understood when to advance and when to withdraw. He was learning that reputation, once broken, could never quite be mended, that a handshake meant something in this world because these men dealt with each other for decades, that bankruptcy was not merely financial but moral, a stain on the family name that persisted for generations. His colleagues in the office noted him, not immediately, because he was quiet, almost deliberately inconspicuous, but over time, there was something in the way he observed. He did not trade on emotion. He did not rush into enthusiasm. He seemed to be listening to a music that others could not quite hear, a deeper current beneath the surface chatter of the markets. He kept meticulous notes. He arrived early and left late. He began to master not just the mechanics of merchant banking, the language of bills of exchange, the intricate choreography of moving money across the Atlantic in an age before telegraph or telephone could accelerate transactions, but the deeper psychology of it, the way that capital flowed toward trust, like water toward low ground. The 1850s and early 1860s were extraordinary years for American finance. Railroads were spreading across the continent like a nervous system through a waking body. Every new line needed capital. Every line connected producer to consumer, farmer to market, carrying not just goods but the promise of a transformed continent. A young man with access to European money and the patience to understand American geography could do very well indeed. Morgan possessed both. He began to take on commissions, to facilitate transactions, to learn which railroad entrepreneurs were visionaries and which were merely thieves in a waistcoat and cravat. His early reputation, what little was recorded, suggests a man almost abnormally deliberate. While other young men of his station might have sought the glitter of New York society, Morgan seemed to regard such things with a kind of patient indifference. Did he attend balls? Certainly. Did he know the right families? By birth and education he did. But he appeared to prefer the language of numbers to the language of gossip, the architecture of a financial transaction to the architecture of a fashionable parlor. Whether this was genuine temperament or a calculated posture is perhaps impossible to say with certainty, but the effect was the same. People began to notice him because he was not demanding to be noticed, a quiet shift in the social ecology of Manhattan's financial world. By the early 1860s, Pierpont Morgan had begun to handle increasingly substantial transactions. He was no longer merely learning, but beginning to direct. He was corresponding with his father across the Atlantic, absorbing the lessons that Junius had distilled from his own decades in London. The merchant banking world was a world of networks, of family connections, of the understanding that a favor done today might be repaid in capital access tomorrow. Morgan seemed to possess an almost intuitive grasp of this, the way some men understand cards or chess, the ability to see not just the immediate transaction, but the longer arc of advantage and obligation. There is a quality to the apprenticeship years that bears reflection. They were not glamorous. They were not the years by which Morgan would be remembered, yet they were formative in a way that no amount of inherited wealth could have shortened. He was learning that power, real power, the kind that lasts, is not seized but accumulated, grain by grain, through consistent judgment, through the careful cultivation of relationships, through the demonstration again and again that you understand something about the world that others do not. He was learning that the greatest fortunes are built not on a single brilliant transaction, but on the repetition of sound transactions, the slow compounding of advantage and trust. And as the 1860s approached, as America began to tear itself apart in civil war, Morgan's education, in the deeper rhythms of capital, would be tested in ways that would either destroy him or transform him into something altogether more formidable than his youthful diligence had suggested. When the drum rolls came down Broadway in the spring of 1861, young Pierpont Morgan was 24 years old, stationed in New York, and possessed of a quality that would define the rest of his life, a talent for seeing opportunity where others saw only upheaval. The war that tore the nation apart would not tear his fortune apart. Quite the opposite. It built it, though perhaps not in ways that would have sat comfortably with the moral clarity of hindsight. In those first confused months of the conflict, while regiments marched and the industrial machine of the North began its terrible acceleration, Morgan had already positioned himself in a peculiar space, not quite soldier, not quite civilian, but a young financier acutely aware that wars, like all human catastrophes, require funding. He had connections. His father, Junius, was abroad, navigating the treacherous waters of transatlantic finance during a time when England wavered dangerously close to recognizing the Confederacy. The younger Morgan, meanwhile, remained in New York, watching, thinking, calculating. There is an uncomfortable transaction that shadows the beginning of his Civil War fortune. one that historians have debated with varying degrees of sympathy ever since. In 1862, Morgan was part of a scheme involving the purchase of defective rifles from an army arsenal in New Jersey. The rifles, 5,000 of them, had been deemed unfit for service. They were old, unreliable, likely to explode in the hands of the men who carried them. Yet a government contract was drawn up. The weapons would be sold as scrap, purchased for a pittance, then resold back to the military at a considerable markup. The profit, split among the men involved, was substantial. Morgan's share was around $17,000, a fortune for a young man of his years and position. And the rifles, those dangerous, defective weapons, would be issued to soldiers who had no idea what they held in their hands. It is worth pausing here, because this moment reveals something essential about the nature of Pierpont Morgan and his era. He was not a man without conscience. The historical record suggests he was capable of genuine feeling, of aesthetic sensitivity, of loyalty and even tenderness in his private sphere. Yet he was also utterly capable of compartmentalizing. The soldiers who might be killed by those rifles existed in a different mental chamber from the young man counting his profit. This was not cruelty in the Victorian sense, not a sadistic pleasure in suffering. It was something perhaps more corrosive, a complete separation of financial transaction from human consequence. When the rifle scandal broke, as such scandals do, there was an inquiry. Morgan was implicated but not ruined. He denied involvement, though the evidence was substantial. The matter faded, as many such matters did in a government frantically focused on winning a war. He was not prosecuted. This too would become characteristic, a kind of institutional immunity that seemed to follow Morgan throughout his life, a sense that the rules that governed ordinary men operated less stringently in his case. Yet the Civil War years were not solely about such moral compromises. Morgan was also learning the architecture of modern finance in real time. The war demanded resources on an unprecedented scale. The Union needed to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. Government bonds had to be sold, foreign credit established, currencies stabilized across the chaos of a fractured nation and an uncertain international market. These were the stage where Morgan and men like him performed their essential function. A young banker who could help the government float a bond issue, who could navigate foreign exchange markets, who could borrow from London and lend to Washington, became suddenly, urgently valuable. In 1863, Morgan participated in a gold transaction that was far more ambiguous than the rifle scandal, less crude, but perhaps more sophisticated in its implications. As the war dragged on, gold became a scarce and precious commodity, the bedrock of international credit. Morgan and a consortium of American financiers bought gold on the market while simultaneously advising the government on gold policy. The line between private profit and public interest blurred so completely that it becomes difficult now to say where one ended and the other began. When the value of gold rose, as it predictably did, Morgan's group profited enormously. Were they simply making sound financial investments, or were they gaming the very system they claimed to serve? The answer, almost certainly, was both. What is striking about these transactions is not that they were unique. They were not. The Civil War, like all wars, created vast opportunities for men positioned to exploit the gap between civilian need and military desperation. What was unique about Morgan was the scale at which he would eventually operate, and his instinctive understanding that the future belonged not to men who made money haphazardly from crisis, but to those who positioned themselves as essential participants in managing crisis itself. By the middle years of the war, Morgan had begun to shift from opportunistic trading towards something more systematic. He understood that the government needed not just money, but confidence, that stability in financial markets was as much a weapon in the hands of the Union as artillery or naval power. The man who could help provide that stability, who could convince London bankers that American bonds were worth holding, who could move capital across oceans and currencies with speed and assurance. Such a man would not merely profit from the war, he would emerge from it with a foundation for something far greater. There were moments during those war years when Morgan was away from the trading floor, moments when the purely financial view of human catastrophe gave way to something else. He traveled, briefly, to the Cotton Kingdom, the South, on business, seeing slavery's machinery firsthand. No record exists of him expressing moral revulsion. He was interested in the business aspects. This too is characteristic of a certain kind of historical figure, a man so thoroughly oriented toward the mechanisms of transaction that the content of what is being transacted becomes almost invisible to him. By 1864, when the war was entering its final, exhausted phase, Pierpont Morgan had accumulated perhaps $200,000, a substantial fortune, certainly enough to establish himself as something more than merely another ambitious young banker. But more than money, he had accumulated something less tangible and more valuable, a reputation. He was known as a man who could deliver, who understood the linkages between military need and financial possibility, who had connections in London and the ability to move in the highest circles of American finance. He was known, crucially, as a survivor, someone who had navigated the war years without serious moral or professional damage, someone who had come out, not just intact, but enriched. And as the guns fell silent in April of 1865, as the nation began its strange and painful work of reconstruction, there was a question that hung unasked but understood among the men who controlled capital in America. If war had made Pierpont Morgan rich, what would peace allow him to become? The man who would come to command the financial machinery of a nation was, in his private quarters, a creature of deep and unspoken longing. For all the power that accumulated around him, the deference of presidents, the trembling of markets at his word, there existed within Morgan a quieter hunger, one that no amount of gold or influence could wholly satisfy. It was in the realm of human connection, of love and loss, that his formidable will proved helpless, and where the vulnerability beneath that iron composure revealed itself most plainly. In 1861, at the age of 24, still climbing the careful ladder of his merchant banking apprenticeship, Morgan married Amelia Sturgis. She was the daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant, and by all contemporary accounts, the union appeared to be one of those sensible arrangements that bound together the great mercantile families of the eastern seaboard. Yet there are whispers in the correspondence of those early years, in the careful language of old letters, suggesting that Morgan harbored genuine affection for her, that beneath the contractual nature of their alliance lay something warmer, something approaching tenderness. The marriage lasted precisely 10 months before tuberculosis claimed her. She was 23. Morgan was at her bedside when she died, in the winter of 1862, and the loss, though perhaps not unexpected in an era when consumption moved swiftly through even the wealthiest households, struck him with an intensity that seemed to reshape something fundamental in his nature. Those who knew him in the months that followed spoke of a man diminished in some ineffable way, as though a portion of his capacity for open feeling had been sealed away, locked behind reinforced doors that would never again be unlocked. He did not remain unmarried for long. In 1865, 3 years after Amelia's death, Morgan took a second wife, Frances Tracy, the widow of a man named Charles Tracy, and herself a woman of considerable intelligence and family standing. Their marriage was, by nearly all accounts, one of genuine partnership. Francis understood the world he inhabited, made few demands upon his time, and seemed to accept with equanimity the fact that his first love would always be the machinery of finance and the accumulation of power. Yet there persisted in Morgan, throughout this second marriage and for the remainder of his life, a kind of emotional reserve, a careful distance maintained even from those nearest to him. It was as though Amelia's death had taught him a lesson he never quite forgot, that intimacy itself was a luxury, a vulnerability that the world did not permit to men of consequence. Or perhaps it was simply that the loss had occurred at a moment when he was still forming the essential architecture of his personality, still deciding what he would become. Whatever the truth of his inner experience, the result was a man who could command armies of financiers with a glance, yet who spent his evenings in private rooms, collecting paintings and manuscripts, building around himself a fortress of singular taste and controlled solitude. Francis bore him 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and Morgan was by all evidence a conscientious if distant father, providing for their education and their futures with the same methodical care he applied to every other aspect of his life. Yet even within the domestic sphere, he maintained the habits of a man accustomed to keeping counsel with himself. His children knew him as a figure of authority and dignity, rather than as a source of warmth or easy affection. There was love there, undoubtedly, but it was expressed in the language of provision and discipline rather than in embrace or effusive sentiment. The years that followed Amelia's death saw Morgan's ascent through the world of banking accelerate with almost inexorable momentum. Was it coincidence, one might gently wonder, or was there something in the alchemy of personal loss that had transformed him into the relentless operator of financial markets? The grief, carefully compartmentalized and contained, may have provided a kind of fuel, a drive to build monuments to permanence that could not be taken away by illness or chance. His banks, his corporations, his restructured industries, these became, in a sense, the children he could nurture and control in ways that human affection never allowed. And yet there remain, scattered through the historical record, small moments that suggest the softer man beneath the formidable exterior was never entirely extinguished. Colleagues would occasionally catch glimpses of him in an unguarded moment, his expression softening as he examined a newly acquired painting or a rare manuscript in his library. These objects became, it seems, the repositories for the tenderness that human relationships had taught him to fear. In surrounding himself with beauty, with the artistic and literary treasures of centuries, he was perhaps engaging in a conversation with something larger than himself, something that could not disappoint or abandon him. The loss of Amelia, then, stands as a subtle but profound marker in the formation of J.P. Morgan's character. It was not the kind of loss that would be broadcast in his public biography or mentioned in polite society. Death was commonplace enough in the 19th century, and wealthy men were expected to absorb such blows with stoicism and move forward. Yet for Morgan, that passage through grief seems to have crystallized something essential in his worldview, a conviction that the world operated according to principles of order and rational management, and that personal emotion, while perhaps tolerable in small doses and in private, was ultimately a luxury, that weakness. Power, by contrast, was something one could build and control, and it would not die, would not leave, would not betray. This is the paradox at the heart of Morgan's character, and it would shadow everything that followed: the triumphs, the influence, the transformation of American finance. The man who learned to move markets and nations was, in his most private self, still grieving the loss of a young woman in winter, still carrying the weight of a 10-month marriage as the measure of all his later accumulation. And perhaps this is why, no matter how much wealth and power he gathered around himself, there remained in Morgan something unsettled, something searching, as though he were still looking for something that no amount of financial architecture could quite restore. By the time Morgan reached his middle years, the contours of his life had begun to resolve into something altogether more formidable than the uncertain young man who had moved between counting houses and merchant offices. He had inherited, quite literally, his father's continental connections. Junius Morgan had spent decades weaving the threads of London finance to the great banking houses of Europe, and increasingly, to the wealthy merchants and industrialists of America. It was upon this delicate, complex web that young Pierpont would now build something altogether more ambitious. And the vehicle for that ambition would be a partnership that, while perhaps unremarkable in its founding, would reshape the very architecture of transatlantic commerce. In 1864, when the Civil War still raged, and the nation's finances were in profound disarray, Morgan entered into partnership with the Philadelphia banker Anthony J. Drexel. The House of Drexel had long been respected in mercantile circles, known for a kind of steady, unpretentious competence in the movement of goods and credit between American ports and European exchanges. Drexel himself was 20 years Morgan's senior, established, cautious, and possessed of that particular Philadelphia quality of wealth that eschewed ostentation in favor of quiet authority. It was a pairing that might have seemed, to observers of the time, merely practical, the older man's reputation lending stability to the younger's ambition. But there was something deeper at work, something that speaks to Morgan's intuitive understanding of how power actually accrues in the world of finance. What emerged from this partnership, slowly at first and then with gathering momentum, was not simply another banking house among the dozens that littered Wall Street and the financial quarters of European cities. Rather, it became a mechanism for concentrating capital and information in ways that had scarcely been possible before. Morgan understood, with an almost preternatural clarity, that the future of banking lay not in the simple intermediation of credit, the buying and selling of bills of exchange, the discounting of merchant paper, but in the orchestration of great movements of capital across oceans and borders. He saw that the transformation of America from a provincial agricultural republic into an industrial giant would require unprecedented flows of investment, and that whoever could reliably channel European gold and British securities into American enterprises would wield an almost monarchical influence. Consider the practical realities of transatlantic finance in those years. Communication between London and New York still depended upon the rhythms of steamship travel. A letter of credit might take 10 days or more to cross the ocean. Information moved slowly, fragmentarily, always vulnerable to distortion and delay. The great merchant banks of Europe, those ancient institutions that had financed the wars and the commerce of centuries, were deeply embedded in London's financial markets, intimately connected to the great underwriters and the brokers of the city. American banks, by contrast, were often provincial, locally focused, lacking the reach and the connections that would allow them to compete in the international movement of capital. This was the gap that Morgan perceived, and it was into this gap that he stepped with almost startling deliberation. The founding of Drexel, Morgan and Company in 1871, when Junius Morgan's existing London house was reorganized to formalize the partnership, represented the creation of a unified transatlantic institution in a way that had not truly existed before. For the first time, there existed a banking house with the capital, the connections, and the absolute trust of investors on both sides of the Atlantic. Pierpont Morgan, stationed in New York, could move capital and information to and from London with a speed and efficiency that no competitor could match. His father's relationships with the great men of British finance, relationships built over decades of careful cultivation, became, in a very real sense, his inheritance. It was as though he had been given the keys to a vast, invisible city that existed only in the ledgers and the correspondence of banks, in the quiet conversations between gentlemen of established wealth. And yet the elegance of what Morgan constructed lay precisely in its apparent simplicity. There were no great innovations in technique, no new financial instruments or mechanisms. What Morgan did was rather to perfect the art of being a trusted intermediary, a man whose word, quite literally, was as good as gold. When a European investor wondered whether it was wise to place capital into an American railroad or a manufacturing concern in Pennsylvania, Morgan's recommendation carried weight. His signature on a document of credit was accepted without question in London drawing rooms and New York counting houses alike. This was not merely business success, though it was assuredly that. It was the construction of a kind of financial trust that transcended the ordinary mechanics of commerce. The network that emerged from Drexel, Morgan and Company's operations was, in its way, as intricate and carefully maintained as any diplomatic apparatus. There were correspondents in the great financial centers, Paris, Berlin, Frankfurt, Amsterdam. There were understandings with the Bank of England, relationships with the great discount houses of London, connections to the private banking families that had dominated European finance for generations. Information flowed through these channels constantly, subtly, never quite documented in any formal way. Which railroads were sound, and which were headed toward insolvency? Which American industrialists could be trusted to repay their loans? Which European investors were most eager to place capital into American ventures? This knowledge, constantly refreshed and refined, became the true source of Morgan's power. Think of the advantage this conferred. While other American bankers worked largely in isolation, constrained by provincial markets and limited information, Morgan was connected to a vast intelligence network that spanned the Atlantic. He knew, often before anyone else, which way the currents of capital were moving. He could anticipate the needs of clients before they themselves had fully articulated them. He could discern patterns in the movement of wealth that remained invisible to competitors operating in more limited spheres. This was not magic, nor was it the result of any singular moment of genius. Rather, it was the patient, methodical construction of a system that worked to concentrate knowledge, capital, and trust in a single place, Morgan's own hands. And crucially, Morgan understood something that many of his contemporaries did not, that the real profits in banking lay not in small percentage points earned on numerous transactions, but in the great movements of capital that could be orchestrated when one possessed sufficient trust and sufficient reach. To finance the building of a new railroad required not thousands of small transactions, but rather the assembly of enormous sums of capital from multiple sources, coordinated across continents, underwritten by the personal reputation of the banker who stood at the center of the web. This was a fundamentally different way of thinking about banking, and it required a fundamentally different kind of banker, one with the nerve to stake his own reputation on vast transactions and the connections to assemble the capital that such transactions demanded. The transatlantic network that emerged from these years was, in many ways, invisible to the public eye. There were no advertisements, no public pronouncements. Instead, the work proceeded in the quiet back rooms of banks, in long letters written in careful script and carried across the ocean, in conversations between gentlemen that left no formal record. Yet its effects rippled through the entire American economy. Which enterprises received capital, and on what terms? Which entrepreneurs were able to finance their visions? Which industries could expand, and which were left starved of investment? These questions were answered, increasingly, not by the impersonal forces of the market, but by the deliberate choices of one man and his network. And so, almost without the American public realizing it, their economic future had been placed in the hands of a banker who was connected far more securely to the great banking houses of Europe than he was to the democratic processes of his own country. The offices where Morgan spent his daylight hours were nothing like the glass towers that would later come to define American finance. To step inside a banking house of the 1880s and 1890s was to enter a world of deliberate restraint, of surfaces designed to communicate permanence through the very plainness of their materials. Mahogany dominated, dark, heavy, carved in the restrained Victorian manner into frames and desk fronts and chairbacks. All of it meant to suggest that wealth, real wealth, required no decoration beyond the wood itself. The grain spoke for itself, The weight spoke for itself. There was no glitter here, no ornamental excess. Instead, there was the quiet assurance of old money, the kind that had survived panics and wars and the slow, grinding wear of decades. The desks themselves were substantial things, often 7 or 8 feet across, their surfaces often bare, except for an inkwell and perhaps a leather desk pad and a pen. One imagines Morgan at such a desk, his characteristic frown fixed on whatever papers lay before him, his fingers spread on its cool surface as he considered a proposition, a loan, the restructuring of a corporation. The desk was not where calculations happened, largely. The mathematics belonged to the younger men, the clerks and junior partners who worked at smaller tables in the outer offices, their heads bent over ledgers. The desk of a man like Morgan was where judgment occurred, where the yes or no was issued, where trust was either granted or withheld. And trust, in those days, was a thing one could nearly feel in the air itself. The banking houses of New York and London operated on a system that seems almost miraculous in its simplicity when one considers how much money moved through it. A Morgan partner might receive a letter, written by hand, sent by steamer across the Atlantic, arriving perhaps 10 days later. The letter would describe a transaction, a loan, a commitment, and based on nothing but the reputation of the house from which the letter came, based on the name and the history and the unspoken promise that the signature represented, millions in gold or currency would change hands. How extraordinary that becomes if one pauses to think about it. The entire financial architecture rested on a foundation of reputation and personal honor. A handshake, or even just the knowledge that an agreement had been reached in writing, was sufficient. The lawyers would formalize the details later, but the certainty was already in place. The deal was done. What made this system function at all was something almost invisible to modern understanding. It was the knowledge that a man's word, once given, could not be broken without destroying not just his business, but his entire social standing, his ability to move in the circles where power gathered. For someone like Morgan, such destruction would have been literally unthinkable, not for moral reasons necessarily, though he was hardly amoral, but because his entire existence, every comfort he possessed, every door that opened to him, rested on the assumption that when Pierpont Morgan made a commitment, that commitment would be honored. To break his word would be to unmake himself. The physical spaces reflected this burden of trust. The banking house was austere not from poverty but from confidence. There was no need to display wealth because wealth was understood to be present. The offices were designed to be reassuring, almost meditative in their effect. High ceilings, large windows, often with heavy curtains that could be drawn, fireplaces with marble mantels, the furniture arranged in a way that suggested serious conversation rather than hurried transaction. When a client or correspondent entered such a space, they were entering a temple of stability. The message was not spoken but felt. Your money will be safe here. Your business will be conducted with deliberation. We are not going anywhere. We have been here, we will remain, you may rest assured. The ticker tapes themselves, those mechanical devices that transmitted stock prices across the country in real time by electrical pulse, occupied their own rooms, usually separated from the main office floor. The sound they made was distinctive, a rapid chattering that has been described by everyone who worked near one as being faintly unsettling, as though the machine was speaking to itself in some urgent, private language. The ticker was the heartbeat of the market, visible and audible to anyone nearby, and yet its message could only be truly understood by those who knew how to read the symbols it imprinted on the tape. One would come across a banker or partner standing in the ticker room, eyes fixed on the emerging ribbon of paper, face in shadow, watching the prices emerge in real time. What did he see there? The flow of capital, the anxiety of the market, the moment-by-moment pulse of collective human desire and fear. The contrast between the public spaces and the private offices of the senior partners was subtle but important. Slightly warmer, perhaps. A painting on the wall, Morgan increasingly surrounded himself with art, even in his working spaces. Better light. A sense that here, in this room, the most consequential decisions would be made. Here is where the partner would listen to a proposition, his face giving almost nothing away, and then either consent or demur, and that single decision might reshape industries or nations. It is difficult to imagine, from the vantage point of the 21st century, the extent to which American business depended on the personal judgment of a handful of men, and how that judgment was exercised in these quiet, mahogany-walled rooms. The rituals mattered almost as much as the spaces themselves. The formality of dress. Morgan famously dressed impeccably, and his partners and associates were expected to maintain a similar standard. No slouching, no casual speech. The manner of greeting, the offering of a chair, the way a visitor was invited to state his business, and then the quality of attention he received. For a younger banker seeking Morgan's patronage, seeking entry to his circle of trust, these moments were everything. One's bearing, one's clarity of thought, one's ability to present a complicated financial problem in a manner that demonstrated both comprehension and humility. These were the things that mattered. Morgan was reputed to dislike pretense, yet he also respected formality. How does one navigate that distinction? One imagines his associates learning to read his silences, the particular way he might lean back in his chair when he was considering something, the slight movement of his eyes when something in a proposal troubled him. The business of banking, at this level, was almost monastic in its discipline. The hours were long but not frantic. There was no shouting, no visible panic, even during crises. The assumption, always, was that thought and deliberation would prevail over emotion. The problems that came through the door of a banking house were large ones. The financing of railroads, the capitalization of new industrial concerns, the movement of gold between continents. These were not problems that could be solved quickly or carelessly. They required time. They required the kind of deep, focused attention that modern life seems increasingly unwilling to grant to anything. Morgan was famous for his capacity to concentrate, for his ability to sit in contemplation of a problem for hours, turning it over in his mind, seeing its shape from multiple angles before arriving at a solution. And perhaps that is what the physical world of these banking houses ultimately conveyed, a validation of patience, a physical embodiment of the belief that real power, the power that actually moved money and shaped industries, did not announce itself loudly. It worked quietly. It thought carefully. It trusted itself to reach correct conclusions through deliberation rather than haste. The mahogany, the high ceilings, the careful arrangement of furniture, the ticker tapes chattering in their separate room, all of it was saying the same thing. Here is where the serious work happens. Here is where fortunes are made and broken. And precisely because the stakes are so high, we conduct ourselves with proportion and restraint. By the time the 1870s had settled into their quieter rhythms, America's railroad network had become something like a wild, untended garden, sprawling in all directions at once, beautiful in its ambition, but utterly without order. Thousands of miles of track crisscrossed the continent, laid down by competing companies, many of them run by men who saw no reason to cooperate when competition promised such fevered profit. The railroads were America's bloodstream then, the only arteries through which goods and fortunes could truly flow from coast to coast, and yet they bled constantly with waste and redundancy. Whole routes ran parallel to one another, built not because they served any logical purpose, but because a rival company had built a line nearby and someone had to stop them. Rates fluctuated wildly. A shipment that cost reasonable money one season might bankrupt a shipper the next. Investors poured capital into these enterprises, and watched it evaporate into the air like morning mist. The entire system, for all its promise and reach, was unstable in a way that made every transaction precarious. Morgan had watched this chaos unfold for years while building his banking house and his reputation in transatlantic finance. But chaos, he had learned, was not inevitable. It was simply the absence of discipline, and discipline, like credit itself, could be imposed by those with the vision and the leverage to enforce it. What had begun as isolated interventions, a loan here, a negotiation there, gradually evolved into something far more systematic. When a railroad found itself in difficulty, Morgan appeared. Not as a savior exactly, though many would later call him that. He appeared as the man who could see the way through, the banker who understood that a railroad in bankruptcy was worth nothing to anyone, while a railroad that had been consolidated, rationalized, and removed from the sphere of naked competition could be worth everything. The work was technical and tedious in ways that the newspaper accounts never quite captured. It required reading through the most excruciating financial documents, understanding the tangled ownership structures of rival companies, sitting with exhausted men across mahogany tables and helping them see that their dreams of monopoly were illusions, that they were far better served by accepting a reasonable return within a stable system than by continuing to exhaust themselves and their shareholders in endless, ruinous competition. Morgan had a talent for this kind of negotiation, perhaps born from his years watching his father navigate the intricacies of international trade. He could be patient when others were frantic. He could be quietly firm when others grew desperate. And he had something else, something harder to name, the genuine belief that his way forward, his rational, orderly way, was not merely profitable but right. When he intervened in the affairs of the New York Central, the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore and Ohio, Morgan brought with him not just capital, but a vision of what American railroads could become if they stopped warring with one another like jealous monarchs. Rather than fighting over every mile of track and every shipping contract, why not acknowledge the geographic reality, accept the inefficiency that competition itself created, and divide the continent in a way that allowed each major line its own territory and its own reasonable profit? It was a form of rationalization that would later be called something else: cartelization, monopoly, restraint of trade, by critics who saw in it a betrayal of the free market's promise. But Morgan saw only waste being eliminated, only chaos being transformed into order, and for a moment, in the 1870s and early 1880s, the railroads seemed to agree. The actual mechanics of these negotiations were, in truth, often invisible to the public. Morgan would invite the heads of competing railroads to his office or to his home, and there, in spaces designed to evoke quiet authority and trustworthiness, he would ask them to recognize a simple fact: that the market could not indefinitely sustain this many competing lines, that prices would continue to plummet as long as rate wars went on, and that the only sustainable path forward was one in which competition was channeled rather than eliminated, preserved in the sense that separate companies continued to exist, but subordinated to an overarching system of understood limits and predictable returns. There is something almost hypnotic in the thought of this process, isn't there? The quiet insistence on rationality, the patient explanation of economic fact, the subtle suggestion that those who resisted his vision were not merely foolish, but were actively choosing to harm themselves and their shareholders. It worked because it was partially true. The railroads were indeed destroying themselves through competition. Excess capacity did create ruinous prices. The investors who had built these empires were indeed losing money rather than gaining it. Morgan offered them a way out that preserved their pride, allowed them to keep their companies, and promised them dividends instead of bankruptcy. For many, especially those who had been bleeding capital for years, it was irresistible. As the years passed and Morgan accumulated successful interventions in the railroad world, his reputation shifted subtly. He was no longer simply a banker who had helped solve a particular crisis. He became, in the eyes of both the financial community and the wider public, the man who understood how America's railroads should actually work. When problems arose, when a line fell into receivership, when a merger looked necessary, when rates once again began their descent into chaos, Morgan's name was mentioned almost as a matter of course. The railroad presidents themselves began to seek his counsel not as supplicants approaching a distant authority, but as practical men who had learned that Morgan's intervention, while it might limit their ambitions, at least ensured that they would survive to enjoy whatever profits remained. What had begun as a series of individual negotiations had become, by the 1880s, something more like a system of governance, a private, banker's system imposed over the scattered, competing entities of American railroading. And the curious thing, the aspect that would haunt America's understanding of Morgan for decades to come, was that it worked. The railroads became more efficient. The rates, while less wild in their fluctuations, became more stable and more predictable. Investors who had lost fortunes in the previous decade began to receive dividends again. The chaos did not disappear. It never entirely disappears from any market, but it was bounded, contained, made manageable, and all of it rested on Morgan's willingness to apply the banker's most ancient tool, the quiet accumulation of trust, repeated over time, in situation after situation, until one man's word and one man's vision had become, for an entire industry, the measure of what was possible and what was right. By the 1880s, the American railroad had become something like the circulatory system of the nation, carrying blood and capital from coast to coast. Yet this vast network was desperately sick. Thousands of competing rail companies, many founded on speculative fever and wishful thinking, had built lines that duplicated each other's routes, undercut each other's prices, and drained away profits with the efficiency of an open wound. What had been meant to connect America was, in many ways, tearing it apart. Investors lost fortunes, managers went to war with one another, and the ordinary person traveling between cities found themselves at the mercy of chaos, dressed up in corporate names and legal documents they could never hope to decipher. Morgan looked at this disorder and saw what others saw, a problem. But where most men saw only damage and loss, he saw an opportunity to impose order, and in that order, to discover an almost elegant form of profit. The technique that would later be called, somewhat admiringly and sometimes with a note of dread, Morganization, was born not from a grand philosophical vision, but from something far more practical, a banker's quiet certainty that the world ought to obey certain laws of reason, and that if it would not obey them voluntarily, they could be imposed through the patient application of capital and will. Picture, if you will, a man in his office on Wall Street in the closing hours of afternoon light. The sun is falling away beyond the Hudson, casting long shadows across the room. Morgan sits at a desk that seems to carry the weight of dozens of conversations, contracts, and calculations. Before him lies information, endless streams of data about railroad companies, their routes, their debts, their earnings, their rivalries. To most bankers, these were separate facts, separate problems. To Morgan, they were pieces of a puzzle that could only be solved if someone had the courage and capital to move them all at once. His method was deceptively simple, though its execution demanded an almost surgical precision. First, he would identify a railroad industry in a state of competitive collapse, say, the railroads of the South, or those threading through the Middle Atlantic states. Then he would gather together the competing lines' owners, directors, and creditors. Not by force, you understand. Morgan was never crude in that way, but by making it clear, through the gentle, irresistible pressure of credit availability, market knowledge, and the simple fact that his word carried more weight than most men's oaths, that cooperation was not only possible, but profitable, and more than that, necessary. The alternative was mutual destruction. What happened next was a kind of financial choreography. Morgan and his partners would take charge of the railroad's finances, studying them with the attention of a physician learning the anatomy of a body. They would eliminate redundant routes, cutting away the lines that served no purpose except to drain resources. They would consolidate the managements, replacing quarrelsome, ambitious men with more moderate operators who understood that their job was to serve the system, not to dominate it. They would stabilize rates, not by collusion, though his critics would later accuse him of exactly that, but by establishing reasonable, uniform pricing that ensured steady profit rather than the violent swings of predatory competition. And crucially, they would refinance the accumulated debts, restructuring them in ways that made the whole organism viable again. The railroads that emerged from Morganization were not necessarily better in the way a reformer might hope. They did not pay workers more handsomely or treat them with greater kindness. But they were rational, they were solvent, they did not collapse in every financial downturn, and they returned steady dividends to the investors who had placed their trust in them. In an age that understood itself through metaphors of order emerging from chaos, Morganization became a kind of visible proof that such emergence was possible, that a great disorder could, through intelligence and will, be transformed into stability. By the mid-80s, Morgan had orchestrated the consolidation of dozens of railroad lines, and in doing so had become something unprecedented in American finance. He was no longer merely a banker, a man who loaned money and collected interest. He was a kind of financial architect, a restructurer of entire industries. The railroads he touched did not merely survive, they flourished, at least on paper and in the accounts. Their stocks rose, their bonds became sought after. Investors who had nearly lost everything suddenly found themselves, if not enriched, then at least secure. And yet there was something curious about his methods, something that would later trouble the American conscience. Morgan was, in essence, creating monopolies, or near monopolies, out of the wreckage of competition. He was consolidating power in ways that seemed to contradict the free market principles that Americans held, at least nominally, as sacred. Was he saving the railroads, or was he controlling them? Was he serving the nation's interests, or his own? These were questions that many people asked in the privacy of their homes, and that would eventually be asked, much less privately, in congressional hearing rooms. But in the closing years of that decade, such doubts seemed to belong to the future. Morgan had proven something powerful and seductive, that chaos could be organized, that disorder could be made profitable, and that one man, armed with knowledge, capital, and the trust of others, could reshape the economic geography of a nation. The railroads ran on time, the dividends came due, the system worked. And in a nation that had only recently emerged from the moral and physical wreckage of civil war, the promise of order, of system, of rationality, imposed upon disorder, seemed almost worth the price of surrendering a little freedom to a banker who had proven he knew how to manage the affairs of empires. There arrived in the 1880s, in the fermenting laboratories and machine shops of New Jersey and upstate New York, a man whose vision was so peculiar, so insistent, so utterly at odds with the gas-lit world that had endured for a century, that most serious people dismissed him as a visionary, which in those days was another word for a dreamer unlikely to be trusted with substantial sums. Thomas Edison had a notion, not new perhaps, but refined to an obsessive clarity, that the future would be powered not by flame or candle, not by the slow burn of oil lamps that had illuminated humanity's evenings since ancient times, but by a current moving invisibly through copper wires, harnessed to a filament that would glow with steady, dependable light. To most of the banking world, this was an abstraction. To most of America, still largely lit by gas and candlelight, It was a luxury that belonged to science fiction. But Morgan, by the late 1880s, had begun to see something others could not yet fully grasp: that whoever controlled the distribution of electric light would control the future itself. Morgan's relationship with Edison was never one of easy camaraderie. Edison was intuitive, peripatetic, a man who worked in shirt sleeves in his laboratories and emerged blackened with soot and filament dust. Morgan was formal, methodical, a man who thought in structures and systems and the long geometric arrangements of capital. Yet between them there existed a kind of mutual recognition, the acknowledgement that Edison possessed something essential, the ability to translate imagination into apparatus, to take an idea floating in the realm of theory and make it material, tangible, profitable. And Morgan possessed what Edison perpetually lacked: access to the vast reservoirs of money that such grand experiments demanded. By 1881, Edison's Pearl Street station had begun to supply electric light to a small neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, a pilot program that proved the feasibility of centralized power generation and distribution. It was modest in scale, uncertain in its future, yet it represented a proof of concept that Morgan understood immediately. When Edison sought capital to expand his operations, to build generating stations across the country, to transform the entire infrastructure of American illumination, Morgan became his patron and his financier. The relationship was transactional, certainly, but also something deeper, a marriage of two different kinds of genius, each recognizing in the other the capacity to reshape what the world could be. What followed was a quiet drama, almost unnoticed by the newspapers of the time, which were far more preoccupied with Morgan's railroad consolidations and his rescue of the Treasury. Morgan decided that his own residence on Madison Avenue would be the first private home in New York to be fully and completely illuminated by electric light, not as a curiosity, not as an experiment, but as a statement, a declaration that the future had already arrived, at least for him, and that he was now living within it, while the rest of the city still relied on the yellowish flicker of gas lamps in the streets below. The installation of those first electric fixtures in his Madison Avenue mansion was, in its way, as revolutionary as the erection of a palace in medieval times, a visible assertion of power and access to technologies that the vast majority of citizens could not yet afford or even imagine within their own walls. Morgan's home became, in effect, a showpiece, a proof of the destiny that he and Edison believed awaited the nation. Visitors would remark upon it. The electric light burned steadier than gas. It produced no smoke, no soot, no danger of open flame. It could be switched on or off by turning a small lever. It was, by the standards of the 1880s, miraculous. Yet even as Morgan's own home glowed with this new illumination, the broader work of electrification remained immensely complicated. Edison favored a direct current system, which worked well over short distances but became inefficient across larger territories. George Westinghouse, Morgan's competitor in many realms, championed alternating current, which could travel much farther and thus promised to electrify America more completely and more rapidly. The competition between these two systems became known, somewhat melodramatically, as the War of the Currents, a struggle that touched not only on technical matters, but on the future structure of American power itself. Morgan, having committed himself to Edison's direct current philosophy, found himself increasingly on the side of a technology that, however superior in certain respects, would ultimately prove less practical for the large-scale transformation of the nation. This was not a failure, precisely, though one might observe it so. Rather, it was a moment in which Morgan's capacity to recognize and fund the future encountered the hard constraints of physics and practicality. Edison himself, that most restless of inventors, would eventually begin to work with alternating current as well. Accepting the logic of what the technology could accomplish, even if it had not been his first choice. And Morgan would adjust his own investments and alignments accordingly, always following the geometry of profit and influence, even when it meant acknowledging that one's initial vision, however clear and compelling, might need to shift. But in those early years of the 1880s, when electric light still seemed like the very cutting edge of possibility, Morgan's illuminated mansion on Madison Avenue stood as a beacon, quite literally, of a man who had chosen to live not merely within his own time, but slightly ahead of it. He had positioned himself, through capital and relationship and an almost prescient understanding of technological destiny, at the threshold between the old world and the new. The gaslights of the city might still flicker below him, but within his own walls, within the rooms where he conducted business and where he would entertain the powerful and the influential, the future was already glowing with steady, dependable light. One might imagine those first visitors to his home ascending the stairs in the electric brightness, seeing their hands and faces rendered visible by a glow that had no flame, no smell, no danger of explosion. One might imagine their quiet astonishment, their sense that something fundamental had shifted in the world, even if they could not quite name what it was. And one might imagine Morgan, watching them adjust to this new brightness, understanding that he had placed himself, once again, where power would reside. By the early 1890s, the world that Morgan had built was running on certainty, on the quiet confidence that gold backed the promises engraved on paper. Yet beneath the polished surfaces of the great banking houses, an old fear was gathering in the shadows. America's economy had grown faster than any nation's before, wild and beautiful and unstable all at once, and the railroads he'd just finished taming were only one small part of a machinery that no one truly understood in its whole. The gold standard, that glittering foundation upon which all faith in currency rested, had begun to feel less like a law of nature and more like a performance that required constant attention. The year 1893 arrived with an almost imperceptible tremor. It began not in New York but in London, where certain nervous bankers began asking questions that no one wanted asked. Was American gold truly there? The question seems almost quaint now, but in that moment it unraveled confidence like a thread being pulled from an old garment. If people began to believe that the Treasury couldn't meet its obligations in gold, then it wouldn't matter whether the gold was there or not. Belief itself would dissolve, and with it, the entire delicate mechanism of modern commerce. Within weeks, that distant whisper became a roar. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, once a symbol of American industrial might, collapsed into bankruptcy. That failure rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water, and the concentric circles of panic spread across the nation. Banks that had seemed immortal just days before began to fail. Depositors who had never questioned the solidity of their savings suddenly rushed to withdraw them in gold, and the institutions could not possibly meet these demands. How could they? The gold wasn't there in the quantities claimed, and the realization of this gap between promise and reality sparked something primal and devastating. Suicides followed. Businesses that had occupied the same buildings for generations locked their doors. Men who had been wealthy beyond imagining found themselves standing on street corners without prospects. The unemployment swelled as factories closed and construction halted. It was not merely a financial correction, but something closer to a collapse of nerve, a moment when the American future itself seemed to be in question. In the autumn of that year, the crisis deepened into something resembling an abyss. The United States Treasury, that great repository of national gold, was bleeding out. People wanted gold for their currency, and the government was obligated by law to exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. As the Treasury's reserves dwindled day by day, a new terror began to take shape in the minds of politicians and bankers alike. What would happen when the gold was gone? Would the currency become worthless? Would America lose its place among the great powers of the world? The very thought was almost unbearable. It was in this moment, as winter approached and the panic seemed to be approaching some terrible climax, that J.P. Morgan began to move. He did not summon the president to his office, though he might have. He did not hold grand public meetings or issue proclamations. Instead, he moved quietly, deliberately, the way a master craftsman moves when he understands not only what needs to be done, but exactly how the human beings involved will respond to his actions. He already knew much of what was happening, because his network of information was extraordinarily fine-grained. His partners, his correspondents, his associates in London and Paris had been sending him reports for months. He understood the situation better, perhaps, than the government officials who were ostensibly in charge of managing it. Morgan called together a consortium of the most powerful bankers in America and Europe. He convinced them that their own survival depended on rescuing the Treasury. If the federal government ran out of gold, the entire financial system upon which their own fortunes rested would be compromised. This was not an appeal to patriotism, though patriotism may have played some small role in their calculations. It was an appeal to enlightened self-interest, which Morgan had always found to be the most reliable motivator of human action. These men would help rescue the Treasury, because doing so served their own interests. And that was precisely as it should be. In the winter of 1894, an agreement was reached in circumstances that would later seem almost impossible to modern eyes. Morgan and a consortium of bankers, prominent among them August Belmont, a figure of nearly equal stature in New York's financial world, agreed to supply the Treasury with a substantial shipment of gold. In exchange, the government would issue bonds that Morgan and his allies could sell. The gold would flow into the Treasury vaults, steadying the nerves of those who still believed in the American currency. The bankers, meanwhile, would take the bonds back to Europe and sell them for gold at a premium, thus turning the Treasury's desperation into their own considerable profit. One can read in this arrangement a certain elegant symmetry, though perhaps not a symmetry that would please everyone. The bankers were saving the nation from financial catastrophe, and they were being quite handsomely rewarded for doing so. Was this justice? Was this exploitation? Perhaps it was, in a way, both things at once. Morgan had stepped into a vacuum of governmental power and filled it with his own will and his own network. The crisis had revealed something that would trouble Americans for the next generation. The federal government, for all its size and authority, could not manage a financial emergency without the cooperation and direction of private bankers. Whether this was a permanent feature of modern capitalism or a temporary condition awaiting a better solution remained an open question. Yet there was also something almost exhilarating about the speed and certainty of Morgan's action, something that seemed to demonstrate the power of intelligence and will in the face of mass fear. The gold arrived. The Treasury's reserves stabilized. The panic, though it would continue to ripple through the nation's economy for months and even years, had been arrested at the moment when it might have become genuinely catastrophic. Unemployment remained high, suffering was real and widespread, but the fundamental collapse of the entire system had been prevented. In the weeks and months that followed, the nation's newspapers were filled with Morgan's name. He had become, in the eyes of some, a hero, the man who had saved America. In the eyes of others, he had become something more troubling, a reminder that power in America had consolidated into remarkably few hands, and that the government's authority was now dependent upon the goodwill of bankers who answered to no constituency but their own interests. And so we arrive at a peculiar moment in American history, one that invites us to pause and consider something that would have seemed, to any observer standing on Wall Street in the autumn of 1893, almost incomprehensible in its implications. The United States Treasury had been emptied. The nation's gold reserves, the bedrock of American creditworthiness, and the promise that backed every dollar in circulation, had fallen to a point so perilously low that the government itself faced the prospect of insolvency. Congress could not act quickly enough. The political machinery, even with the best intentions, moved too slowly. And so the question became not whether America would survive its financial crisis, but whether a single man, a banker whose offices sat not in the Capitol but in a private townhouse on Madison Avenue, could perform the feat that the elected government could not. This is perhaps the moment when we must ask ourselves what we are truly witnessing. It was not that J.P. Morgan possessed some magical ability to conjure gold from thin air or to command the markets through supernatural means. Rather, he possessed something far more mundane and yet far more consequential, the absolute trust of the world's financiers. When Morgan spoke, the great banking houses of London listened. When he opened his vault, capital flowed from across the Atlantic. When he stood before a meeting of rival bankers and industrialists in his library, men who had spent their lives competing fiercely with one another, they deferred to his judgment. They believed him. And in the architecture of modern finance, belief is not a small thing. Belief is the substance itself. Consider the strange nature of what occurred during those weeks in the winter of 1893. A private citizen, acting on no legal authority beyond the implicit consent of other wealthy men and the tacit blessing of a desperate president, undertook to save the national treasury. He did this not through coercion, but through persuasion. He convinced the banking syndicate to purchase bonds. He assured foreign investors that American credit remained sound. He mobilized his own network, his own reputation, his own accumulated moral capital, built across decades of careful dealings and honored promises. And the markets believed him because he had never failed them. The gold returned, the treasury was replenished. The nation stepped back from the precipice. But what did this victory actually mean, if we are honest about its implications? It meant that the United States government had, in its moment of greatest vulnerability, placed its faith not in its own institutions, but in the discretion of a private banker. It meant that one man's judgment about what was prudent, what was fair, what was necessary, had become the judgment of the nation itself. Morgan had not seized power. The government had, in effect, handed it to him because it had nowhere else to turn, and Morgan, to his credit, did not use it poorly. But the question that would linger in the minds of thoughtful Americans for decades afterward was this: what happens when that man is less prudent? What happens when his judgment is clouded by self-interest or ambition? What happens when the private interests of the banker diverge from the public good? There is something almost sorrowful about power when it accrues in this way, not through direct usurpation, but through the slow, inevitable concentration that occurs when one institution becomes more reliable, more capable, more trustworthy than all others combined. Morgan did not wake one morning and decide to become more powerful than the government. Rather, the government became progressively weaker in the specific domain of high finance, and Morgan, who had devoted his life to the mastery of that domain, became proportionally stronger. It was less a coup than an evolution, less a theft than an abdication. The newspapers of the time, sensing something extraordinary had occurred, began to speak of Morgan in almost mythic terms. He was the master of Wall Street, the savior of the nation, the man upon whose shoulders the entire financial structure of America rested. But Morgan himself remained, as always, remarkably private about all of this. He did not court the publicity. He did not seek adulation. He had simply done what he believed was necessary, using the tools and relationships he had spent a lifetime assembling. And yet in doing so, he had revealed something essential about the nature of American financial power. It was not democratic, it was not transparent, and it was not subject to the kinds of checks and balances that governed the visible machinery of government. It operated in the mahogany-paneled rooms of private clubs and the drawing rooms of great houses. It moved along cables of trust that connected the great cities of the Western world. It answered, ultimately, to no one but itself. What is perhaps most striking, when we consider this moment from the distance of our own time, is how little debate it initially provoked. Yes, there were some voices raised in concern. Yes, there were those who understood instinctively that something had shifted, that a line had been crossed. But there was also a kind of acceptance, an almost grateful acknowledgement that when the nation faced catastrophe, there had been someone competent and willing to act. In that gratitude lay a danger that only became fully apparent years later: the willingness to cede power to those who could demonstrate their competence, regardless of whether that concentration of power served the broader interests of democracy itself. Morgan himself, moving through those crisis weeks, probably did not think of himself as wielding power in any unseemly sense. He was simply doing what he had always done: solving problems, managing crises, bringing order to chaos. That this particular problem happened to be the solvency of the United States government was, from his perspective, merely a matter of scale. But the precedent had been set. The possibility had been demonstrated. America now knew that when its government failed, it could be rescued by its richest men. And in knowing this, America had found a curious sort of substitute for genuine financial governance. The question of what to do about this reality would occupy the nation's political imagination for the next several decades. By the last decade of the 19th century, something extraordinary was stirring in the American consciousness. The railroads had been tamed, their chaos given order and system through Morgan's patient work. The banks had been steadied. The currents of electricity were beginning to illuminate the darkening cities. And yet there remained one final frontier of consolidation, one last vast sprawling industry that seemed to epitomize everything America was becoming and everything that frightened it about its own ambitions. That frontier was steel. Steel was America's nervous system in those years. Every bridge, every building that reached toward the sky, every locomotive that pulled the nation forward, all of it required steel. Yet the industry that produced it was fragmented, chaotic, prone to ferocious competition and ruinous price wars. Hundreds of small and medium firms battled one another with the desperation of creatures fighting for survival. Profits vanished into the trenches of competition. Innovation was squandered. The very abundance of capacity meant that nothing seemed to work as it should. There was one man who had built something different, and that man was Andrew Carnegie. Where others fought over margins, Carnegie had built a vertically integrated empire. He owned everything from the iron ore in the ground to the finished steel rails that left his mills. He had assembled the most efficient, most modern steelworks in the world. He had made himself fabulously, almost absurdly wealthy, and by the time he was in his 60s, something had begun to shift in him. The pleasure of conquest had faded. He had begun to think about legacy, about libraries and universities, about the life of the mind that lay beyond the furnaces and the ledgers. Morgan understood this about Carnegie, or at least he came to understand it. In 1900, as the new century was still in its infancy, Morgan began to move. It was not a sudden thing. It was the work of patient conversation, of careful positioning, of allowing circumstances to align themselves in ways that seemed almost inevitable in retrospect, though nothing was inevitable at all. The vision Morgan held was almost too large to articulate in the boardrooms of the time. He wanted to create something that had never existed before. He wanted to gather the greatest steel producers in America, to organize them under a single holding company, to apply the logic of Morganization to an entire industry. And at the center of that vast structure, he wanted Andrew Carnegie. But Carnegie was reluctant. He was rich enough. He did not need more wealth. And he harbored, perhaps, some doubt about whether anyone could truly command the industry as he had. Morgan needed to think differently. He needed to approach Carnegie not as a subordinate, not as a man who would simply fold into someone else's empire, but as a man who had already built an empire and now needed to consider what it meant to step aside, to pass the torch, to think about something larger than himself. The historian must pause here, because what happened next carries within it something almost poignant. Carnegie, in the privacy of his thoughts and his letters, seems to have been wrestling with this question for years. Should he sell? Should he hand over what he had built? The price would have to be extraordinary. It would have to honor what he had created, and there was, perhaps, the deeper question of whether he trusted anyone to handle it, to preserve what he had built while expanding it into something new. Morgan moved with extraordinary delicacy. He did not storm into negotiations. Instead, he allowed others to carry his vision forward. There were discussions, proposals, counter-proposals. There was the matter of figuring out what the enterprise would be worth. Carnegie, with his characteristic shrewdness, had made a rough calculation on a piece of paper one evening. He knew, roughly, what he thought his company should fetch, and he waited to see if Morgan would meet that price. The figure Carnegie had written down was $480 million. It was almost incomprehensibly large for the time. It was roughly equivalent to saying that one man's company was worth what the entire national government spent in a year. Morgan, when he heard the number, is said to have paused. It was a fortune. It was, in fact, more than the annual budget of most nations, but it did not deter him. What emerged from these negotiations was the United States Steel Corporation, incorporated in 1901. It was the first corporation in American history to be capitalized at more than $1 billion. The words themselves had a strange power. $1 billion. It sounded like a number from mythology, a number that belonged to gods or to dreams, not to the ordinary business of smelting iron and rolling steel. The creation of this company was, in its way, a culmination of everything Morgan had been working toward. It was not simply a matter of buying up smaller firms and combining them. It was an act of will, a reshaping of industrial reality according to a vision of order and efficiency. The company would control roughly 70% of American steel production. It would employ more than 100,000 people. It would generate profits that seemed almost supernatural in their scale. But something shifts in the story at this moment. Something that perhaps no one foresaw. When you create something that large, when you gather that much power in a single institution, when you organize an entire industry according to one man's vision, you have created something that unsettles the democratic imagination. You have embodied a truth that Americans have never quite wanted to face. And that truth is that in a world of industrial scale, in a world where railroads and steel mills have replaced villages and farms, the old assumptions about competition and individual enterprise may no longer apply. Morgan did not see it this way, or perhaps he saw it but thought it irrelevant. He had created order from chaos. He had created efficiency from waste. He had created a company that could serve the nation's vast and growing needs for steel. He had honored Andrew Carnegie by meeting his price, and he had created a fortune for himself in the process. The mathematics were perfect, and yet, somewhere in the nation's consciousness, a question was forming. If one man could gather an entire industry into his hands, what did that say about the American experiment? What did it say about democracy? What did it say about the distribution of power in a nation that had been founded on the assumption that power should be divided, dispersed, held in check by competition and by law? These were not questions Morgan asked himself. He was a banker. He understood the logic of consolidation, the mathematics of efficiency. The moral and political implications seemed to him, perhaps, secondary to the practical reality of what he had accomplished. He had taken the chaos of American steel and given it form. He had created something of vast and enduring value. For the moment, at least, that seemed like enough. And so while Morgan's name became synonymous with the raw mechanics of power, the consolidation, the negotiation, the decisive stroke that steadied empires of capital, there existed, in the quieter hours, a man of remarkably different hungers. The same intelligence that could dissect a railroad's balance sheet and reimagine its destiny turned, with equal intensity, toward beauty, toward objects, toward the accumulation of things that spoke to something beyond profit or influence. There was in him, perhaps, a hunger for permanence of a different kind. His library on East 36th Street became, over the decades, one of the most extraordinary private collections ever assembled on American soil. Not a vanity project, though it was certainly that as well, but something more genuine, a sanctuary built from thousands of decisions, each one made with the careful eye of a man who understood rarity the way he understood credit. Manuscripts dating to the earliest centuries of European Christianity. First editions of the great printers of Venice and Florence. A Gutenberg Bible, naturally. Books bound in leather worn smooth by centuries of careful hands. Renaissance paintings that had graced the walls of cardinals and merchants of Medici Florence. Chinese porcelains that had traveled the silk routes centuries before his birth. What drew him, one might wonder, to this accumulation? Perhaps it was the opposite of what drove him into banking at all. In the markets, in the exchanges, value was volatile, constantly negotiated, dependent on the mood of crowds and the whispers of other men's fears. But here, in the rooms he built to hold his treasures, value was settled. Fixed. A medieval manuscript could not be watered down like railroad stock. A painting by Raphael would not collapse under the weight of speculation. These objects had already survived centuries. They would likely outlive him. In them was a kind of stability, a quiet permanence that money, for all its power, could never quite guarantee. The library itself became an act of architecture, a Renaissance palazzo transplanted into the Manhattan grid, designed by McKim, Mead and White with the seriousness one might bring to a cathedral. Its facade rose 4 stories of limestone and granite, bearing no sign of what lay within. To enter was to step out of the Gilded Age entirely and into a suspended moment of Europe's own golden age. Soaring ceilings, marble staircases, alcoves designed specifically to hold particular treasures. The main reading room rose 3 stories, ringed with galleries, its walls lined with calf leather and oak. Clerks and curators moved through its silence like monks in a scriptorium. It was, to those who saw it, one of the most beautiful rooms in the city, if not the country. Few outsiders ever glimpsed it. Morgan did not throw open his doors for exhibitions or social entertainment. The library was not public. It was perhaps the most private expression of his wealth and taste, which perhaps made it the truest one. The collecting itself had begun decades earlier, in his travels to Europe as a young man, in the years when he was still forming his aesthetic eye. He bought with increasing confidence, sometimes with extraordinary boldness. When he learned that the British Museum had elected to sell certain items from its collection, an action unthinkable now, a moment when even sacred institutions faced financial pressure, Morgan purchased without hesitation. He acquired entire collections that other men had spent lifetimes assembling. He outbid competitors with the same calm certainty he brought to financial negotiations. Money was, to him, a tool for acquiring not just power, but beauty. And in the late 19th century, when America's industrial wealth was expanding beyond the calculations of even the wealthiest men, he could afford almost anything. Yet there was in this collecting something almost melancholy, one might suggest, a quality that bears gentle reflection. He was assembling, it seemed, a museum of memory and culture, at precisely the moment when American wealth was severing itself from European tradition, when the very railroads and industrial machines he was financing were remaking the continent into something entirely new. Was he perhaps trying to hold on to something, to preserve in these carefully curated rooms a world that was vanishing even as he helped engineer its replacement? His personal taste ran toward the Renaissance. He had developed, in his years abroad, a connoisseur's eye for the period when art and commerce had first begun their complicated dance. When the Medici family, merchants themselves, bankers, had understood that power required not just wealth, but the cultivation of beauty. The parallel would not have escaped him. He collected the way Renaissance princes collected, as a form of immortality, as a way of saying to the future, I was here, and I understood something worth preserving. My wealth was not merely spent on material accumulation. I knew how to recognize lasting value. It was during these same years that he became, informally, a patron and confidant to artists and curators. He advised museums on acquisitions. He financed expeditions to uncover ancient artifacts. He understood himself as a custodian of civilization, in some sense, a keeper of the flame in an age of raw extraction and rapid change. His money granted him this role. His genuine knowledge and passion for it made the role, in a surprising way, almost noble. The solitude of collecting fed something in him, unlike the conducting of financial transactions, which required constant engagement with other minds, other wills, other egos. The life of a collector was one of contemplation. You stood before an object. You studied it. You considered its origins, the hands that had made it, the centuries it had traveled, the eyes that had gazed upon it before you. There was in this a kind of meditation, available perhaps only to a man with sufficient wealth and privacy to pursue it without interruption. He spent hours in his library. Those who worked for him spoke of finding him, late into the evening, standing before a particular painting or manuscript, not examining it with an eye toward use, but simply present with it, quiet, thoughtful. His apartments at 36 East 36th were furnished with the same care, filled with objects that spoke to his cultivated tastes. Comfortable, certainly, but not lavish in the manner of many of his contemporaries. No gaudy ostentation, no rooms designed merely to demonstrate wealth. Rather, a sophisticated arrangement of beautiful things. The spaces where he lived were, in effect, curated. Nothing there by accident. Nothing there except because he had deemed it worthy of his attention. It was, in a way, an extension of his personality, his precision, his seriousness, his refusal of the merely fashionable or popular. Perhaps one can sense, in this collection, in these carefully maintained spaces, something of the private cost of his public power. The banker who could bend economies had, in the privacy of his library, a different kind of hunger, not for gold, though he possessed that abundantly, but for permanence, for beauty that would outlast his influence, for objects that spoke to something deeper than commerce, something almost spiritual in nature. In this, if nowhere else, he was entirely alone. These were his conversations with history. These were the hours when J.P. Morgan, the great consolidator, the man who bent institutions to his will, could simply exist in the presence of things greater and older and more lasting than himself. By the autumn of 1907, the rhythms of Morgan's life had settled into what seemed a sustainable pattern. He was 70 years old. His collection had grown magnificent. His library housed first editions that would have taken another man a lifetime to acquire. He had proven himself the guardian of American finance more than once, and the nation had learned to depend on his steady hand. There was, one might have imagined, a sense of earned quietude approaching, but the markets, as they often do, had other arrangements in mind. The warning signs had been gathering through the year like clouds before a storm that no one wished to name aloud. There had been tremors, a banking failure here, a credit squeeze there, railroad stocks had begun to slip, building construction slowed across the cities. The wealthiest men in New York sensed something shifting beneath them, something that the language of statistics and quarterly reports could not quite capture. It was a feeling, perhaps, a loss of confidence so diffuse and wordless that it seemed almost foolish to speak of it in the marble halls of the banks. Yet confidence is the invisible architecture upon which all financial systems rest, and when it begins to crack, the sound is like nothing else in the world, a hollow, spreading doubt that moves faster than any telegram can travel. October arrived. The stock market, which had been wobbling, began to fall with genuine urgency. Brokerage houses that had seemed permanent fixtures started to show cracks in their composure. By the 17th of the month, a run had begun in earnest. People wanted their money. They wanted it now. The question that rippled through the financial district with increasing desperation was always the same: is there enough gold? Is there enough actual money in the vaults? Or have we been living in a dream of credit and promises? And once that question enters the public mind, the dream collapses rather quickly. Morgan, now an old man but still formidable in presence and conviction, watched from his private sanctum as the panic deepened. He was not in his office at the bank during these crucial days. He was in his library on East 36th Street, in the great house adjacent to his collection, surrounded by the books and manuscripts and paintings he had gathered over decades. It was here, in rooms filled with beauty and quietude, that he chose to conduct the most urgent business of his life. There was perhaps a symbolic poetry in this, that he would organize the rescue of American finance, not from a counting house, but from a sanctuary of art and learning. The library itself was becoming the headquarters of crisis management. Morgan would sit in the great room, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the soft lamplight of evening, and summoned bankers would be brought to him as though he were a modern Medici in his palazzo, dispensing wisdom and direction. Word went out through the financial district: if you wish to know what is to be done, you must come to Morgan's library. And they came. The leaders of American banking filed through those doors night after night, sometimes remaining until dawn, sometimes returning the next evening for more conversation. The scene had an almost dreamlike quality to those who participated in it. The most powerful men in America, gathering in a room full of paintings and medieval manuscripts, while the world outside descended into financial frenzy. What was Morgan doing during these long nights? He was listening. He was asking questions. He was understanding, with a clarity that came from decades of experience, which institutions were truly threatened and which were merely panicked. He was separating the solvent from the insolvent with the precision of a man who had spent half a century understanding the difference. And having understood the problem, he was organizing the solution. The strategy, improvised though it may have seemed in those tense hours, was remarkable in its scope. Morgan worked with Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, to ensure that government funds could be made available to stabilize the banking system. He coordinated with other prominent bankers to create a pool of capital that could be deployed where it was most urgently needed. He negotiated which institutions would be rescued and, sometimes, which would be allowed to fail. There was an old-fashioned moral dimension to his choices too. Institutions that had been prudent and conservative might be saved. Those that had been reckless or speculative were treated with considerably less sympathy. He was, in effect, serving as both doctor and judge to American finance. The panic had reached the point where it threatened not merely individual banks, but the entire structure of credit upon which the economy depended. If the panic continued unchecked, if people's faith in banking itself was destroyed, the consequences would be catastrophic in ways that are difficult even now to fully articulate. The electricity would not flow, the factories would slow, the railroads would falter. The whole intricate modern world that Morgan himself had helped to build would begin to seize and crack. During these days and nights at the library, Morgan was operating at the extreme outer limit of what a private citizen could legally do. He had no formal governmental authority. He was not appointed by anyone. He held no elected office, and yet the Secretary of the Treasury was consulting him as though he were a co-equal authority in managing the nation's money. Powerful bankers, who would ordinarily have been rivals, perhaps even adversaries, were taking his counsel as final. Decisions that would affect millions of people's livelihoods were being made in his private study. It is a remarkable thing to contemplate, even now, at this distance, what Morgan had become, and how willing America had been to invest such power in a single private individual's judgment and integrity. Was this arrangement proper? Was it just? Did it represent a dangerous concentration of authority in the hands of one man? These are questions that many thoughtful people were already asking themselves, and would continue to ask with increasing intensity as the events of those weeks became better known. But in the moment, in the crisis itself, there seemed to be no alternative. The institutions of government were not equipped to move with the speed and decisiveness that the situation demanded. There was no Federal Reserve, no organized system for national banking stability. There was only Morgan and the confidence that men had placed in his judgment. In that moment, that confidence may have saved the Republic, or at least the financial system upon which the Republic depended. Whether the price of that salvation was too high would become a question that animated American politics for years to come. The panic gradually subsided as October moved into November. The immediate threat of total collapse receded. Confidence, that intangible and mysterious thing, began to return to the markets. Brokers began to speak to one another again with something approaching ease. The depositors who had been standing in lines to withdraw their savings went home satisfied that their banks would remain open. The railroad stocks stabilized. Life in the great cities resumed something closer to its ordinary rhythm. And Morgan, exhausted beyond the measure of what his aging body should have been forced to endure, could finally rest in his library, surrounded by the accumulated beauty of a lifetime, knowing that he had held back the tide once again. And yet, even as Morgan moved through his greatest triumphs, threading gold through America's deepest financial wounds, something had begun to shift in the country's collective consciousness, a slow, rising unease. A question that had begun to whisper through newspaper offices, in Congress, in the modest homes of ordinary citizens who sensed that one man, one mind, one will, one private vault of capital had accumulated a kind of power that seemed to exceed any authority a single human being ought to hold. The very fact that Morgan could rescue the nation in 1893, that his personal decision could stanch the bleeding of the Treasury itself, had begun to disturb people in ways that went beyond the gratitude they might have felt. You see, for those who had lived through that crisis, Morgan had appeared almost as a savior. But for those who stepped back and asked the deeper question, how had things become so fragile that one banker was necessary at all? The answer suggested something was profoundly wrong with the structure of American finance. And this concern, this creeping alarm, it did not evaporate. It accumulated. It took root in the consciousness of reformers, of politicians who sensed a shift in their constituents' mood, of writers and thinkers who began to examine what unlimited financial concentration might mean for a democratic nation. The press had always been watchful of Morgan, but now the tone changed. Where once there had been respect laced with fear, now there began to appear a sharper scrutiny. Magazine writers and journalists started to ask uncomfortable questions. Who was J.P. Morgan, really, if not an unelected ruler of American commerce? What happened when one private citizen could decide the fate of banks, of railroads, of entire industries? The creation of United States Steel, that magnificent billion-dollar monument to corporate consolidation, began to look less like genius and more like a warning. Here was proof that Morgan did not merely respond to crises. He actively shaped the structure of American capitalism to suit his vision. By 1912, a full decade after the Panic of 1907, the mood in Congress had darkened considerably. There was a new energy in the land, a progressivism that had begun to question the very foundations of unchecked private power. And it was in that moment of shifting political will that the House Banking Committee, under the leadership of Congressman Arsène Pujol of Louisiana, decided to conduct what would become one of the most searching, systematic investigations into American finance ever undertaken. The Pujol Committee, as it would be known, set out to examine what its members and the public were beginning to call the money trust. The concept of a money trust was not new, but now it carried a different weight. It suggested something almost conspiratorial, the idea that the great banking houses of New York, with Morgan's at their center, had organized themselves into an informal cartel. They controlled access to credit. They could decide which industries would flourish and which would wither. They could shape the contours of the entire economy through nothing more than their collective will and the vast pools of capital at their command. Was this true? The answer was complicated, as such things always are, but perception, in matters of political will, is often as consequential as fact. The hearings began in December of 1912, and they quickly became one of the great spectacles of the progressive era. Morgan himself was called to testify, and he arrived as he always did, impeccably dressed, dignified, his great head held high, his eyes steady. He was 75 years old by then, his health beginning its slow decline, and yet he carried himself with the bearing of a man entirely unbothered by the proceedings. Perhaps he was unbothered. Perhaps he simply did not believe that Congress, that mere politicians, could genuinely threaten him or his empire. Or perhaps, and this seems more likely, knowing what we know of Morgan, he understood that the world was changing, that he could not stop it, and had chosen to face it with stoicism. The questioning was relentless. The committee sought to understand the scope of Morgan's influence. How many boards of directors did he sit on, or men loyal to him sit on? How much of American railroad stock did he control, directly or through his associates? What about banks, insurance companies? The committee members wanted to understand not merely his holdings, but his network, the intricate web of relationships, partnerships, and personal alliances that allowed one man's preferences to ripple outward and shape the behavior of dozens of institutions. Morgan's responses were measured. He did not deny his influence. That would have been absurd. But he reframed it. He spoke of his role not as control but as responsibility. He had used his position to bring order to chaos, to stabilize industries that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of their own competition and disorder. Was that wrong? He seemed to be asking. Was it wrong to have prevented financial catastrophe? To have organized the railroads so that they operated rationally rather than destructively? To have channeled the great currents of capital toward productive ends? The hearings captured the imagination of the American public in a way that few governmental proceedings ever do. Newspapers published transcripts. Cartoonists drew Morgan as an octopus, his tentacles reaching into every corner of American commerce. The image, crude as it was, conveyed something true about how people had come to perceive him, not as a banker, not even as a businessman, but as a kind of shadow government, a man who wielded power without democratic accountability, without any mechanism by which the people could exert control over him. What is fascinating, from the vantage point of history, is how much this concern resembled anxieties that had animated democracies since their founding. Who holds power? Over whom? By what right? And what happens when that power becomes so concentrated that it exceeds the ability of ordinary democratic mechanisms to check or balance it? These were not new questions, but Morgan, whether he intended to or not, had made them urgent. He had become a living embodiment of the problem itself. The Pujol Committee's final report, issued in 1913, did not recommend criminal action against Morgan or his associates. The law, as it existed then, simply did not provide the tools for that. But the report was a scathing indictment of concentrated financial power. It documented, in meticulous detail, the vast influence wielded by a small group of New York bankers, and it made clear that American society could not, in the long term, continue to depend on the goodwill of one man to prevent financial disaster. In a strange way, the investigation became Morgan's final and perhaps most significant legacy. The very intensity of the public backlash, the congressional scrutiny, the cartoons and editorials and dinner table conversations about whether one man could hold such power, all of this set in motion the reforms that would follow. The Federal Reserve Act, passed in 1913, was in many ways a direct response to the Pujo Committee's findings and to the widespread sense that American finance needed structures and safeguards that did not depend on the character or whim of any single individual. And so the old banker found himself, in the twilight of his life, facing a crisis of legitimacy that no crisis of capital could solve. He had saved the nation's finances, yes, but in doing so, he had revealed something about the nation's finances that Americans found deeply disturbing. The very mechanism by which he had prevented collapse had exposed the fragility of a system that could collapse without him, and a democratic nation, in the end, cannot rest comfortably with such dependencies. There came a season in the life of J.P. Morgan when the weight of empires seemed to settle upon his shoulders with a quiet finality that even his formidable will could not entirely conceal. The years beyond 1907, the years after the Great Panic had passed, and the country had begun to imagine its future without his steady hand at the center of every crisis, were years of a man who had spent his strength and now moved through the world with the careful deliberation of one conscious of time's narrow margin. By 1910, Morgan was entering the winter of his life not with contentment, but with a peculiar restlessness that neither acquisition nor arrangement could quite satisfy. The great banker had always found refuge in motion, in the accumulation of voyages across the Atlantic, in the perpetual quest for beauty and knowledge that his wealth made possible. In his earlier years, these journeys had been purposeful enterprises, buying art, examining banks, establishing networks. But the journeys of his later life took on a different character, a softer urgency, as though he were searching for something he had perhaps overlooked during the decades of construction and consolidation. He began to spend more time abroad, lingering in Egypt, in London, in the countryside estates of England where he could walk without the pressure of a nation's financial system resting invisibly upon his back. His health, which had been a curious mixture of remarkable resilience and unexpected vulnerability throughout his life, began to betray the accumulated cost of 60 years devoted almost entirely to the accumulation of power and responsibility. Morgan had never been a man inclined toward the physical softness that great wealth often encouraged. He had maintained something of the Victorian discipline of his childhood, the habits of a mind trained in exactitude and control, but the body, even one sustained by the finest doctors and the most attentive care, has its own rhythms independent of will. His gout returned with increasing frequency. His breathing grew labored at times. Those closest to him began to notice the subtle shifts in his attention, the moments when even his formidable concentration seemed to waver. In the spring of 1912, nearly 75 years old, Morgan undertook what would be among his final great voyages. He had arranged passage to Egypt, that land of antiquity which had long fascinated him as a repository of undiminished beauty and human aspiration somehow detached from the turbulence of modernity. He did not travel as the imperious banker surrounded by an entourage of subordinates. Instead, he moved more quietly, almost like a man on pilgrimage, attending to objects and places with an intensity that suggested he was trying to gather something essential in the limited time remaining. His notebooks from these travels reveal less concern with acquisition and more with observation, less with possession and more with witnessing. But even Egypt's ancient stones could not quite restore what the years of pressure had taken. Morgan returned to Europe in a state of evident decline, though he maintained his dignity and his engaging conversation with those privileged to remain in his presence. He established himself in Paris for a time, moving between his properties and the homes of friends, always maintaining that peculiar courtliness that had characterized his personal manner even at the height of his financial absolutism. Those who saw him during this period would later remember not the Titan of Wall Street, but an old gentleman moving through galleries and drawing rooms with remarkable grace, speaking of art and history and the particular quality of light in certain rooms, as though these observations were as important as the movements of capital. It is worth noting, with the gentleness such an observation requires, that history is not always kind in recording the private world of powerful men. What Morgan felt in these final journeys, what loneliness or satisfaction or regret may have accompanied his travels, exists largely in the realm of inference and educated speculation. His letters from this period are brief and largely practical. He wrote little of his interior life, but the pattern of his movement, the places he chose to linger, the way his attention turned increasingly toward beauty and art, and the preservation of his collections, suggests a man beginning to contemplate mortality with something approaching equanimity. In the winter of 1912, Morgan's health deteriorated with increasing rapidity. Pneumonia developed, complicated by the chronic ailments that had plagued him for years. The great banker, who had moved through Wall Street crises with unshakable composure, who had summoned presidents and prime ministers and convinced the world's wealthiest men to do his bidding, now found himself in the vulnerable position of age and failing body. He had arranged to return to London, to the Hotel Aix-les-Bains, seeking the therapeutic properties of the waters there, but even this did not provide the relief for which he hoped. What happened next was not a collapse, but rather a long diminishment, the kind that illness often brings to those accustomed to absolute control. Morgan moved through the winter months, staying in various locations across Europe, trying first London, then following medical advice toward a warmer climate. His daughter, his secretaries, his closest advisors arranged everything with the meticulous attention he had always demanded, even as it became clear that all the resources at his command could not turn back what was occurring. This particular struggle, the loss of mastery, the creeping incapacity of the body, the quiet humbling of a mind that had ruled itself through discipline, is perhaps the most poignant chapter in a life otherwise marked by the assertion of will. By March of 1913, Morgan had made his way to Rome, that city which had always held a powerful place in his imagination as a repository of human civilization and artistic achievement. The journey itself, undertaken in his condition, speaks to something stubborn in his nature, something that perhaps refused to accept diminishment as final. Rome had significance for him beyond its artistry and history. It represented, perhaps, a kind of circle completing, a return to ancient seats of power and influence, a city where emperors and popes had ruled the world from positions not dissimilar to those from which he himself had exerted his vast influence. He took rooms at the Hotel Bronhof, receiving only the closest members of his family and a small circle of trusted associates. The Rome that greeted him was a city in the early spring, with that particular quality of light that makes the ancient stones glow with a pale, almost translucent warmth. Did he sit by windows? Did he look out at the city that had been built and rebuilt over 2,000 years? Did he think, as men often do when approaching the end, of the permanence of stone and the evanescence of individual lives, even lives as consequential as his own? The historical record is largely silent on such interior moments. What is documented is that in his final days, Morgan maintained remarkable composure and dignity. He was lucid, articulate, engaged with those around him, even as his body failed. Those who attended him during this period later described a kind of peaceful acceptance, not resignation exactly, but rather a man who had done what he set out to do and now could acknowledge the natural terminus that awaits all mortal life, regardless of power or position. On the morning of March 31, 1913, at approximately 6 o'clock, J.P. Morgan died quietly in his sleep, his family present, in a city of stones and echoes that would outlast him by centuries. The great architect of American finance, the man who had held within his hands the fate of continents, who had moved markets with a word, who had summoned presidents and bent the wills of the mighty, passed from the world with a simplicity that stood in striking contrast to the enormity of his influence. He was 75 years old. In the years that followed Morgan's death, a peculiar silence settled over Wall Street. The great banker had arranged so much, not through law or constitution, but through the sheer weight of his name, his telephone, and the quiet certainty of his judgment. When he was gone, that silence became something Americans had to confront directly. A nation that had relied, almost without admitting it, on the presence of one man in one office on one block, suddenly had to ask itself, what happens when that man is no longer there? The question was not merely philosophical, it was terrifyingly practical. In the 13 years since Morgan had rescued the Treasury in 1893, the American financial system had grown exponentially more complex and more fragile. Railroads sprawled across the continent like a vast nervous system. Industrial corporations had consolidated into corporations so massive they seemed to dwarf government itself. And yet the system's stability rested, still, on the confidence that J.P. Morgan would answer his telephone in a crisis. But Morgan was dead, and no one quite knew who would answer now. The conversations that began in Congress and banking houses and newspaper editorial rooms were careful, almost delicate at first. No one wished to speak ill of the departed, and yet everyone understood something fundamental had shifted. There emerged, gradually, a consensus born not from admiration but from anxiety. America could never allow itself to depend on a single private banker again. The very thought seemed, in retrospect, almost medieval, a nation's currency and credit resting upon the judgment of one man, no matter how brilliant or trustworthy. It was, in some deep way, un-American, or rather, it was a reminder of how far America had drifted from its founding principles of distributed power. The conversations turned toward solutions, not merely reforms but something structural, something permanent, something that would enshrine in law and institution what Morgan had provided through force of personality and private arrangement. The answer, or at least the answer Congress began to construct, was a central bank, an idea that had been proposed and rejected and feared throughout American history. But now, in the shadow of Morgan's death, it seemed less like a concentration of power and more like a safeguard against the concentration of power in private hands. In 1913, 7 years after Morgan passed away in that Roman palace, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. It is worth sitting with this timeline for a moment, allowing its significance to settle quietly. The Federal Reserve was not born from theoretical conviction or abstract principle. It was born from fear, from the concrete memory of a panic that could only be stopped by one man's telephone call, and from the terrible realization that America's economic fate should never rest in such precarious hands again. Morgan's death had made visible what his life had concealed. The system was not strong because Morgan was strong. The system was weak. Morgan had simply been holding it together through personality and will. The Federal Reserve was designed, in structure and in spirit, as an answer to J.P. Morgan, not a condemnation of him. The bankers who helped design it revered him, but a recognition that his very success revealed a dangerous truth. If one man could be so indispensable, then the system was fundamentally unsound. The Fed would be decentralized, with 12 regional banks across the nation, preventing any single city or any single personality from dominating the machinery of credit. It would have a governing board, appointed by the president with Senate approval, subject to law and oversight in ways that Morgan had never been. It would be, In essence, what Morgan had done privately translated into public and institutional form. There is a certain poignancy in this. Morgan spent his life insisting that great financial matters could not be managed by rules or committees or government bodies. They required judgment, individual, swift, unburdened by democratic process or bureaucratic procedure. And he was not entirely wrong. The Federal Reserve, for its first decades, worked because its leaders, men like Benjamin Strong, the first governor of the New York Federal Reserve, understood that banking did indeed require judgment, discretion, and the kind of swift action that democratic processes alone could not always provide. What changed was not the need for judgment, but the locus of that judgment. It moved from the drawing room of one banker to the carefully bounded authority of a central bank. It moved, in other words, from Morgan's private domain into something approaching, if never quite achieving, public accountability. And yet, the ghost of Morgan hovered over this new institution. The Federal Reserve structure bore his fingerprints because the bankers who designed it had learned from him. They borrowed his understanding that financial crises required coordination, that competing interests had to be brought to one table, that swift action mattered more than lengthy deliberation. The very concept of a lender of last resort, which became the Federal Reserve's central function, was Morgan's innovation given institutional form. Meanwhile, the House of Morgan itself endured. The banking empire that Morgan had built did not evaporate with his death. It transformed, evolved, adapted to a world where one man could no longer hold such singular power. His partners and successors, often men Morgan had trained and chosen, continued the business of high finance, of restructuring industries, of moving capital across oceans. The Morgan legacy persisted not just in institutions like the Federal Reserve, but in the actual continuation of the J.P. Morgan and Company, which would grow, merge, and eventually become what we know today as J.P. Morgan Chase. Still one of the world's most powerful financial institutions, though now operating within a framework of regulations and restraints that Morgan would have found cumbersome, but that might have seemed to him, on reflection, oddly sensible. His art collection, those paintings and sculptures and rare books he had gathered in such loving solitude, was not sold or scattered. It became the Morgan Library in New York, a repository of beauty and history open to the public, a monument not to his power, but to his refined taste, to the cultivation of the mind that lay beneath the formidable public persona. Walking those halls, visitors encounter the interior life of a man who had seemed, to most Americans, to be purely a machine of finance and control. They find his illuminated manuscripts, his first editions, his drawings and engravings. They find evidence of a human being who loved beauty as desperately as he loved order. The consolidations Morgan had engineered, the systems he had built, the railroads he had reorganized, and the industries he had stabilized, these endured, largely intact, into the 20th century and beyond. The efficiency he had forced upon American capitalism, the order he had imposed upon chaos, became the scaffolding upon which the modern American economy was built. Whether one sees this as entirely benevolent or deeply troubling depends partly on one's view of what capitalism should be. But it is undeniable that American industrial organization in the 20th century bore the marks of Morgan's vision. Coordinated, efficient, dominated by large corporations that had been brought into rational relationship with one another. Yet the Panic of 1893 and the Panic of 1907, those two moments of near catastrophe that Morgan had personally arrested, remained vivid in American memory as warnings. They served as justification for the Federal Reserve System, for new banking regulations, for the gradual construction of a financial architecture designed to prevent the concentration of power Morgan had wielded. In a way, Morgan's greatest achievement and his greatest vulnerability were the same thing, his power. That power had saved the nation twice, but it had also revealed a dangerous truth about what happens when power is distributed too unevenly. when one person's judgment becomes the basis of national stability. The question of whether Morgan's legacy was ultimately positive or troubling remains, even now, a matter of genuine disagreement among historians and economists. What is not in question is this: nothing quite like J.P. Morgan existed before him, and the systems put in place after his death were explicitly designed to ensure that nothing quite like him would ever be necessary again. The Federal Reserve stands as a monument to both his genius and the dangers that genius implied, a way of saying that we have learned to do what Morgan did, but collectively, rather than trusting it to one man's telephone in an office on Wall Street. And somewhere, in the vast architecture of modern finance, in the Federal Open Market Committee meetings, and the coordinated actions of central banks around the world, in the rules and regulations and checks and balances that govern the movement of capital, there is perhaps an echo of Morgan's vision, not his unchecked authority, but his insistence that order matters, that someone must be willing to act decisively when the system trembles, that individual judgment and coordinated power must sometimes override the friction of process and procedure. He had believed that absolutely, and though we have dressed that belief in institutional safeguards he would have found excessive, we have not entirely abandoned it. We have simply learned to exercise it more carefully, more deliberately, and through many hands rather than one. What remains, perhaps, is not the thunderous certainty of empire, but something quieter, the faint tremor of a question that Morgan himself never fully answered, and which America has circled ever since. For in the end, his story is not really about one man's genius or ambition, however towering those might have been. It is a story about what happens when trust is concentrated into a single pair of hands, when the machinery of a nation's survival depends upon the steadiness of one person's judgment on a single night in a library lit by electric bulbs. The Federal Reserve was born, in some sense, as America's slow-dawning acknowledgement that what Morgan represented, the fusion of personal power and national necessity, could never again be permitted to exist in such naked form. And yet, even as legislators drafted the Founding Act in the years after his death, even as they drew up the architecture meant to disperse the very kind of authority Morgan had wielded, the underlying question remained unanswered. What do we do, as a nation, when crisis comes and we discover that no system, however carefully designed, can entirely replace human judgment, human nerve, human trust? Morgan understood something that bureaucracies still struggle with. He knew that credit is not merely a mechanical function of interest rates and reserve requirements. Credit is fundamentally a relationship. It is one person or one institution extending trust to another across time and uncertainty, betting that tomorrow will arrive and that the debt will be honored. That knowledge lived not in ledgers or formulas, but in the quiet confidence of his bearing, in the set of his jaw, in the weight of his reputation when he stood opposite a frightened man or a panicked market and said, with absolute stillness, that things would be well. Perhaps that is what power truly is, not the accumulation of wealth, though Morgan accumulated wealth beyond ordinary measure, not the control of institutions, though he reshaped them to his will, not even the ability to rescue nations, though he did that too. Power, as Morgan embodied it, is the capacity to make others believe. To make them believe that you know something they do not, that you see further than they can see, that you are willing to stand still when all around you is motion and terror. The irony, of course, is that the very system created to prevent another Morgan proved incapable of preventing future panics. The Great Depression came not many years after his passing, and no amount of bureaucratic structure could stop it. Since then, we have seen crises and rescues, near collapses and careful reconstructions, and in each moment there have been figures, central bankers, treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve chairs, who have had to do what Morgan did in his library. They have had to act on incomplete information, under impossible time pressure, making decisions that would reshape the lives of millions they would never meet. They did so within systems meant to constrain them, yes, but the fundamental act, the lonely decision made in the depths of night, remained unchanged. Morgan's reputation, in the decades after his death, was subjected to the particular judgment of history that comes after the fact. Progressive reformers, economists, and muckraking journalists saw in him a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with America's growth: the consolidation of wealth, the private capture of public function, the arrogance of unelected power. There is truth in that critique. Morgan was not a Democrat in temperament or philosophy. He did not believe that the masses were capable of understanding finance or markets. He was, in many ways, exactly the kind of figure that democratic nations should fear. And yet, it is worth sitting with the strange paradox that he represented. Here was a man so convinced of his own insight, so unbending in his principles, that he was willing to stake his own vast fortune on his convictions. When the gold reserves drained from the Treasury in 1893, Morgan did not merely advise what should be done, he put his own money at risk. He made himself a hostage to the outcome. That kind of personal exposure, that willingness to suffer genuine loss if judgment proves wrong, is not common among the powerful. It may be rare enough to deserve remembrance, even as we remain vigilant against the concentration of power that made such exposure possible. In his final years, when his health began its slow decline and he traveled the Mediterranean seeking respite and beauty, Morgan seemed almost to dissolve back into the private man he had always, in some sense, remained. He walked through galleries in Naples and Rome, accumulating art and manuscripts, as if the noise of Wall Street, the urgency of panics and rescues, had been merely a long interruption in what was always his truest life, a life of quiet contemplation and aesthetic pleasure. Perhaps in that retreat there was a kind of honesty. The power had been real, the consequences genuine, but the satisfaction, it seemed, had never come from the power at all. What we remember of Morgan now is not the fear he inspired or the awe he commanded, though both were considerable. What remains is the particular shape of his vision, a world made orderly, made rational, made to serve the purposes of those who understood how markets and capital actually worked. Whether that was wisdom or hubris depends perhaps on which side of his decisions you found yourself. For the railroads he stabilized became the arteries of American commerce. For the workers whose wages stagnated and who had no say in how those corporations were managed, his gift to American industry looked rather different. In our own time, when we speak of financial crisis and the interventions that save or doom economies, when we watch central bankers and treasury officials gather in windowless rooms and make decisions that ripple outward in ways they cannot fully control, we are in some sense still living in the shadow of the choice that Morgan represented. We have institutionalized the function. We have dispersed the power across committees and boards and advisory bodies. We have wrapped it in academic credentials and empirical methodology. But the fundamental human reality remains. Someone, somewhere, in some moment of pressure and uncertainty, must decide. And that decision, made on incomplete knowledge and bet on outcomes no one can guarantee, will reshape countless lives. Morgan died in Rome on a spring morning in 1913, surrounded by the masterpieces he had spent his life acquiring. The newspapers eulogized him with a mixture of reverence and relief. Relief, it seemed, that the nation would not have to depend on the judgment of one man quite so completely again. The system that emerged in response to his death, the Federal Reserve and the regulatory architecture built up around it, was America's declaration that power should not rest in individual hands. That was a wise impulse, and yet, in all the decades since, there have been moments, panicked moments, twilight moments, when markets seem to be failing and credit seemed to be disappearing, when the question has arisen again, in whispered form: who decides? On what authority? with what assurance that they are acting rightly? The answer is no longer one man in a library, but the question itself has never fully been answered. As this story settles now into stillness, as Morgan's life and era recede further into the depths of history, perhaps what we are left with is not a judgment about whether he was good or bad, wise or overreaching. We are left with the stubborn human fact that someone must decide when the moment comes, that trust must be extended across uncertainty, that authority must be taken up by hands that will never be perfectly clean and never fully worthy of what is asked of them. Morgan knew that. He lived inside that knowledge every day, and perhaps that is why his story continues to move us, even now, not because he was a god or a villain, but because he was a man who understood what it costs to stand in the breach, to hold back the chaos, to make the lonely choice when everything depends on it being right. The lights of Wall Street have grown brighter since his day, the systems more complex, the instruments of finance more intricate and far-reaching than anything he could have imagined. But somewhere inside those systems, the essential question he embodied still persists. And perhaps that is enough, to remember not the man as icon or warning, but as a figure in history who confronted power in its raw form and tried, with whatever mixture of vision and limitation he possessed, to make it serve something larger than himself. That memory can rest now, settling gently as evening falls, as it always has and always will, over the long sleep of the city.